Welcome back to Somnolent Conspiracies, our corner booth in the night where impossible facts by their own alibis. If you've ever driven the long, empty lanes of Nevada, you know the desert's honesty. No cover, no mercy, every lie baked off by noon. That is why the first fog felt like a joke. It rolled over Prospect Flats just after midnight, pale as milk and lit from nowhere, a tide that ignored the weather report. It didn't smell of ocean or sage, only of cold film chemicals, the kind that stain your fingers a little yellow. People stepped outside and saw images, not shapes or shadows but scenes, hung inside the mist like photographs. A diner booth with a chipped sugar jar, a motel bathtub ringed with rust, a pair of hands lowering something heavy into a culvert. By sunrise, the fog was gone. By noon, the sheriff had 2 fresh crime scenes that matched the pictures exactly. Our narrator is Rhea Calder, a forensic photographer who left big city labs for small-town quiet and found herself drafted back into the darkroom. Rhea trusts optics more than she trusts most people. She knows the difference between reflection and evidence, and what it costs when the difference blurs. The sheriff is Tomas Villarreal, careful as a mechanic, wary of legends but too honest to dismiss what he can measure. In Prospect Flats, the casinos are an hour away, the radio stations stutter at the county line, and the sky almost never lies. Almost. Tonight, we will follow a geometry made of vapor and truth, a fog that develops images of murders to come, or perhaps murders already rehearsed. We'll track halide residue on pickup beds, the way a highway light hums when a generator cheats, the tiny war between a motel's neon NO vacancy and the human heart behind it. If the fog carries a memory, someone put it there. If it carries a plan, someone wants witnesses who cannot testify. Keep your eyes narrow and your mind wide. The scene is about to show itself. Part 1, first roll. The fog came without wind. It arrived with the confidence of a regular event and the shamelessness of a trick. Streetlights on Main Street took on halos the color of old lemons, and the world narrowed to the reach of each circle of light. In Prospect Flats, night usually meant distance and the sober geometry of straight roads. Tonight, the town wore a skin of milk. Rhea Calder stood on the steps of the sheriff's office with her camera at her hip and breathed in. The air carried a faint chemical tang that reminded her of training days in a windowless darkroom. She tasted metal at the back of her tongue. A man across the street coughed and said something about a low cloud from the highway. Rhea knew a cloud when she saw one. This fog felt manufactured. She took a slow walk toward the Desert Spoon Diner because that is where people head when the town feels threatened. The diner windows glowed a steady orange. But the glow did not reach the sidewalk in any honest way. Instead, just short of the glass, the fog lifted itself into planes as if it had remembered how to be a wall. Rhea stepped closer and raised the camera. The scene hung in the air like a print in a rinse tray. A booth hovered 3 feet off the ground, made of light and pale shadow. The sugar jar had a chip the shape of a thumbnail. One vinyl seat looked slick, as if a drink had spilled and set. A table knife lay under the lip of the table's edge, and the blade caught the streetlight like a wink. She made 3 exposures to be sure. When she checked the playback, she frowned. Faint lines crossed the file, a ladder of horizontal rungs as if a projector had breathed on the frame. Inside the diner, the night shift waitress put down a coffee pot and stared out at nothing. She saw only fog. Rhea saw a booth that was both there and not there. She lowered the camera and moved her hand through the image. Cold damp ran up her sleeve. The booth dissolved as if annoyed at being touched. A siren rose, short and embarrassed. Sheriff Tomas Villarreal pulled to the curb in a county cruiser. He stepped out with a careful look at the air, the way a mechanic looks at a troubled engine. He did not ask whether this was real. He asked whether anyone was hurt. Not yet, Rhea said. He nodded once. He had the habit of not filling a silence he did not own. Rhea walked him through what she had seen. He listened, then asked her to keep shooting if anything else formed. He would call the power company and ask about fluctuations. He spoke into the radio with that relaxed, steady tone that keeps a small town from panicking. The fog thickened near the motel strip at the edge of town. Rhea crossed the lot of the Mirage Court and felt the temperature fall. The sign said no vacancy even though the place had been half empty since spring. A pane of fog stood in the courtyard like a theater screen. On it, the outline of a narrow tub appeared in the flat color of moonlight. For a moment it was only shape, then ring, then more detail, like a negative coming up in developer. She stepped closer and saw a small oval where the enamel had stained the color of weak tea. A towel hung over the side. It looked like it had been folded and then dropped carelessly in a hurry. She took photographs from different angles because old habits do not retire. The same faint crossbars showed up when she reviewed the files. The lines were regular, not an accident from her sensor. She traced one with a fingertip and found nothing to touch. The air has no seams, she thought, unless someone gives it some. A door opened behind her. Geeta Noor, who ran the Mirage Court with a strict eye for noise and towels gone missing, stared at the fog and then at Ria. "You see what I see?" Geeta said. Ria answered yes and kept her voice neutral. Geeta said there had been no guest in room 12 since noon. She had changed the sheets herself. She had locked the door and placed the key in an envelope with the date on it. Ria asked for the envelope and Geeta went to fetch it without argument. In a town this size, evidence has a way of not wandering far. By the time Ria reached the office, Sheriff Virial was already there, talking with a pair of men in utility jackets. The men promised there had been a brownout on the western feeder line, but nothing that would explain fog that organized itself into pictures. The sheriff asked about backup power. The utility men said the town diesel generator had kicked on for a minute, then handed the load back to the main line. Ria watched their faces when they mentioned the generator. The tone people use for weather is different than the tone for human choices. "Let us start simple," the sheriff said. "We will check the diner as soon as the sun shows what it is willing to show. We will check the motel. Ria, keep that camera warm." Near midnight, Ria stood by the highway that cuts past mile marker 7. The fog hugged the ground. Somewhere out there, a freight train made a tired metal song. Headlights moved on a distant ridge and disappeared. The night felt arranged. Eddie Pike appeared out of the pale. Eddie did odd jobs around town, mostly deliveries for the Lucky Ace Minimart and repairs no one else wanted. He said he had seen the fog do something strange by the diner. He said he had seen little squares along the edge, like film sprockets. Ria looked at him for a beat. Eddie's eyes bounced. He looked like a man who uses his hands often and his conscience less often. She asked him where exactly he had stood when he saw the squares. He pointed without confidence. She thanked him and did not invite him to come along. Dawn took its time. When the sun finally lifted over the low ridge, the fog loosened. The booths in the diner reasserted themselves as wood and vinyl. Sheriff Virial met Ria at the door. Inside, the place smelled of coffee and stubborn patience. They slid into the corner booth Ria had seen in the air. She reached under the edge with 2 gloved fingers. The table had a metal support bar and a bracket. There, at a place where a careless hand might hide a blade, she felt a small nick. She photographed the nick. The metal showed a thin, bright smile. The waitress watched from behind the counter, the pot ready but not poured. The sheriff crouched and looked where Ria pointed. He did not speculate. He opened a small evidence bag and let the camera rule the moment. This is what made him trustworthy in Ria's mind. He understood that a story is a dangerous thing to bring to a fresh scene. At the Mirage Court, Geeta produced the envelope with the key to room 12. It was sealed. The date and time were written on the front in her careful hand. They opened the door together. Inside, the bathroom was neat in the way of rooms that are cleaned as a creed. Still, Ria saw scuff marks on the tile near the tub, a faint smear on the enamel where a towel had rested, and one corner of the bath mat damp to the touch. She photographed everything and then stood still for 30 seconds, because rushing breaks more than it fixes. The sheriff worked the edge of the window with a flashlight and found dust missing where the sash lock would touch if someone pulled it down in a hurry. "None of this proves anything by itself," he said. "Proves that something real passed through the scene the fog showed us," Ria said. They checked the office next. The registry listed no guest for room 12. The cash drawer had the proper number of 20s and the $2 bills Geeta liked to hand out as a joke. The security camera had been off due to the brownout. There was nothing to watch even if they wanted to. Rhea sat on the edge of the manager's desk and scrolled through the night's images. The faint horizontal lines she had noticed in the street were present on every fog frame. She magnified one in and squinted. The lines had a regular rhythm like the raster of an old television. She knew better than to say that out loud without something to back it. She asked the sheriff if the backup generator kept logs. He said yes. The utility men had already checked the start time. Rhea asked about draw spikes. He said he would ask again and make it an order instead of a request. He looked tired in a way that meant he knew this would become a day of explaining what does not want to be explained. They walked back outside. The fog had thinned to a light smear over the parking lot. Eddie Pike stood near the vending machine with a soda he did not open. He asked if the sheriff needed him for anything. The sheriff said not at the moment. Eddie nodded, then told Rhea that sometimes the fog at the dump takes on shapes when the methane flares come on. Rhea thanked him again and made a note to ignore him until she could not. By noon, the radio at the county office crackled with 2 calls in close order. A cook at the diner had found the knife bay empty. A highway crewman had found tracks near mile marker 7 that did not belong to any of their vehicles. The sheriff sent deputies to both places. He asked Rhea to drive with him to the generator shed by the utility easement. They found the generator quiet and smug as machinery after it has done something sneaky. It sat in its concrete nest behind a chain-link fence with a padlock that had seen more sun than rain. The sheriff checked the meter. Rhea walked the perimeter and looked at the ground. The grass to the east was beaten into a narrow path that did not belong to official boots. A length of conduit ran from the wall to a junction box, and from that box a second cable plunged into scrub that did not appear on any sensible plan. At the edge of the scrub, sage leaves carried a pale dust that clung to the ridges like frost. Rhea touched one leaf with the tip of a glove, and it left a yellow kiss. She did not have a laboratory on her. She had her eyes. The dust looked like something that wanted to turn dark when light hit it long enough. She held a leaf in the sun. Nothing happened fast. She would need a test strip to know if her hunch meant anything, but the smell in the air told her she was not wrong. They followed the cable until it sank into the earth like a lie that had found cover. The sheriff marked the spot on a printed map and took a photograph on his phone for his own records. Rhea lifted her camera again and framed the shot with a precise border, the habit of putting a beginning and an end around things. On the drive back into town, the sheriff asked her how she wanted to proceed. Rhea watched the road. The fog had retreated to the shadow of culverts and low ground as if shy of full sunlight. The town wore its regular face again. She thought of the booth in the air, the tub that kept its ring even when imagined, and the faint crossbars that rode every picture she had taken. Something is throwing pictures at us, she said. If there is a projector, it needs power and a surface. We have both. I am going to find the light. Part 2, the negative in the generator shed. Morning made the town look rational again. The light pulled hard edges out of things and promised that the night had only been exaggeration. Rhea Calder did not buy that promise. She met Sheriff Tomas Villarreal at the utility easement where the diesel generator sat behind its fence. The padlock had a clean shine where a master key rubbed the steel. The ground around the shed told a different story. The utility foreman unlocked the gate and handed over a clipboard of printouts without ceremony. The paper showed a start at 7 minutes past midnight. The generator had taken load for 63 seconds. There was a second spike 4 minutes later, brief and hungry. The foreman said there was no record of any municipal building calling for that second draw. He said a short circuit could mimic a call. He did not sound convinced. Rhea studied the ground while the sheriff asked for a copy of the logs. The soil to the east held shallow prints that had kept their shape under the mild dew. The stride length was uneven. Left footfall sat deeper and slightly wider as if the leg carried less trust. She knelt and placed a scale card next to the clearest mark. 10.5 by her eye with a cheap lug pattern that wore flat across the heel. She took a sequence of photographs, then followed the trail along the fence where the chain link sagged just enough to suggest a shortcut. Beyond the fence, the scrub opened to a narrow strip of maintenance road. A set of halogen flood housings had been mounted low on the inside of the fence line. They were angled toward ground rather than sky, as if to light mist instead of distance. The cords feeding them disappeared into a junction box that only looked official. The screws were mismatched, the paint new. Someone had wanted it to pass a glance, not an inspection. The sheriff crouched beside her. He kept his hat pulled down against the kind of sun that lies about comfort. He did not touch the box. He followed the cords with his eyes to where they slipped through a thin cut in the back fence and vanished into brush. "We can get a warrant for the land east of here," he said. "The easement ends at the fence. Past that is town-owned until it meets the old spur road. No one maintains that spur." Rhea nodded and slipped a glove on. She reached into the sage where the cable had pushed through and found leaves dressed in a pale dust. The dust clung in a way that was not like soil. She tapped her finger against a leaf and it left a faint yellow smear on the latex. The smell that rose was not plant, not dirt. It reminded her of trays under a red light and a darkroom fan that had never quite worked. She looked in her kit for a strip of old light-sensitive paper. She kept a few cuttings for tests like this, mostly to check light leaks or teach a rookie about exposure. She wet a corner with bottled water, dabbed the dusty leaf, then placed the damp paper under the noon sun while she waited. The sheriff watched without comment. The utility foreman scuffed his boot and pretended to admire a bolt. The paper developed a small gray bruise where the leaf had touched. It darkened with a slow patience, the way a print comes up when the developer has grown tired but not dead. Rhea breathed out. "Silver halide," she said. "Not pure, but enough to react when light wakes it up." Someone misted these plants with a solution. The residue would hang in the air if you pushed a fan over it. It would give fog a job to do. She walked the line of halogen housings. Some had a film of dust on the lens. She lifted one in her palm and felt that faint tack of chemical breath. The angle of the lamps set a plane at about waist height. A citizen would not notice a lamp aimed at fog unless they were the kind of person who notices why a thing points where it points. The sheriff radioed for a deputy to bring marking flags and for the paperwork that allows a man to dig on land that he already owns. Rhea followed the cable through the cut and into the stretch of brittle grass beyond. The prince led with it. Every few steps a toe dragged. Every few steps a heel dug deep like a man checking his balance. They reached a second box half buried near a metal post that carried no sign. The box hummed with a gentle confidence. Inside, the wiring was careful but not clean. The hands that put it together had known how to strip and crimp, but had not bothered to wipe away the smear of paste. A small fan, the kind used in hobby projectors, chattered in a brave little voice. Rhea stood and listened. Under the fan she heard a low electric tone like a light fixture warming. She pictured the previous night. The generator wakes. The lamps come alive at fence level. The fan pushes a fine aerosol of silver salts across the target area. A light source, wherever it sits, throws images at a mist charge to receive. The fog is not natural. It is a screen. She kept walking the arc where the prince moved. The stride shortened near a knot of creosote and then angled toward the open lot behind the Lucky Ace mini-mart. The Lucky Ace had a photo counter once. The plexiglass had gone yellow from sun. The inside lights now showed shelves of jerky and spare wiper blades. In the corner where customers do not look, the little kiosk where families once waited for envelopes of prints still wore a faded banner that promised 1 hour processing with a smile. They crossed the lot and found Eddie Pike unloading cases of soda from a dented van. He kept his eyes on the work while his mouth ran casual. "Long night," Eddie said. "Fog makes the town drive slow and buy more coffee." Sheriff Vireal asked whether the mini-mart still had the equipment from the old lab. Eddie said most of it had gone to storage or the dump. He said Harlan Mott had taken some for parts because he liked the history of things even when they did not work. He said a lot of words about other people. Rhea asked where the storage was. Eddie scratched his neck and said there was a corrugated unit behind the mini-mart that the owner sometimes used for odd stock. He offered to open it with a key he claimed was for emergency deliveries. The sheriff thanked him and said they would get the key from the owner. Rhea watched Eddie's boots as he shifted from foot to foot. The left boot had a collapse at the outside heel. The sole wore thin near the arch. When he turned, the lace ends showed newer than the body. She made a mental note and took a photograph of the ground where he had stood. The print pattern was a close cousin to the ones at the generator fence, not identical but not foreign. They left Eddie and drove the short block to a row of trailers where a man kept wind chimes on a metal pole like a field of tiny silver flags. Harlan Mott lived in the third unit, a tidy box with a small porch and a radio on the rail tuned to a station that had not learned to stop fading. He opened the door at the first knock and pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose with a finger that had no grease under the nail. Rhea recognized him from years back, a face from the old theater when someone had to keep the film from jumping sprockets. He had lost weight and gained a limp. He moved with a careful grace of a man who had learned not to trust the world when it tilted. "We are asking about lab machines," the sheriff said. "The mini-mart said you rescued a few." Mott nodded and led them into a small front room that had been taught good habits. On shelves sat old metal reels in their boxes. A film splicer rested on a cloth like a small instrument that had been played often and well. A Polaroid camera sat on the end table with a deep scratch over the front element. The scratch ran horizontal, clean and straight. Rhea felt a small click at the back of her mind. She asked whether she could look at the camera. Mott shrugged and said it had not worked in years. Rhea lifted the camera, held it to the light, and lined the scratch with the faint crossbars she had seen in the fog exposures. She did not have a match yet, but she had a direction. On the refrigerator, a receipt for silver nitrate sat under a magnet shaped like a smiling gasoline pump. The signature line read E. Pike in a fast hand. Mott saw her glance. He said Eddie did pickups for the mini-mart since they stopped ordering regular kit. Mott said he liked to show kids how old emulsions behaved on paper. He said it kept the town from forgetting that an image begins with light and ends with patience. He lifted his hands and showed clean palms, then laughed once at his own theater. "Vertigo gets me if I stand too fast. Nights are for sitting in a chair with a radio." The sheriff asked where Mott had been after midnight. Mott said right here with that chair and that radio. He did not offer a witness. He did not look troubled by the lack. Rhea stood by the window and looked at the tiny yard with its neat stones. The wind chimes made a soft, uncertain talk. She imagined a man who cared for machines because machines had rules. She imagined a different man who cared for shortcuts. She thought of the cable that ran into the scrub and the lamps that painted fog at waist height. On the way out, she slipped a glance at a cardboard box by the door holding old contact sheets. The top sheet showed a series of frames of a kitchen table and a pair of hands in soft focus. Someone had studied how scenes teach themselves to a viewer. Back in the cruiser, the sheriff drove without speaking. Rhea watched the mini-mart shrink in the mirror. Eddie Pike wheeled a dolly across the lot with too much energy for a man who had been up all night. His left shoulder dipped with each step. "Mott is too clean," Rhea said. "You think he is the wrong suspect," the sheriff said. "I think he is a suspect that someone wants me to find. I think Eddie is more than a messenger. And I think there is another hand somewhere that knows how to write on air." She opened her notebook and wrote in a steady hand. "Lamp angle, cable route, dust that wants to darken, receipt under magnet with Eddie Pike on the line." The town had become a negative. The only way to print it without losing the truth would be to find the projector and the person who aimed it. "If the fog is a chemical screen," she said, "then someone is developing images in the air. I am going to visit the author before the next scene." Part 3, The Projectionist with Clean Hands. Rhea returned to Harlan Mott's trailer in the late afternoon when the sun lay low and honest across the gravel. The wind had fallen away, and with it the easy excuses a day gives. She knocked and heard the radio pause, as if the person inside had lifted a hand to the dial and decided against silence. Mott opened the door in the same careful stance as before, shoulders level, weight a little higher on the right leg. The limp was there if you looked for it. A small truth that did not ask for pity. "I wanted to look at that Polaroid again," Rhea said, "and to ask about one or two things you might remember from the old photo lab." Mott stepped aside without ceremony. The front room carried the same order. A coil of cable sat on a chair like a sleeping snake, neatly looped. The reels on the shelf had been turned so the labels faced front. Each spool wore a penciled date. There was pride in the arrangement. There was also a readiness, as if the room could be boxed in a minute and moved without losing its shape. He handed her the Polaroid camera with the scratched lens. The scratch had been etched by something steady and deliberate. It ran across the glass like a ruler mark. Ria held the camera at arm's length and sighted through the gouge toward the far wall, where a calendar hung with photographs of old theaters. The scratch broke the image into steps. She imagined those steps writ faint across a fog panel, a ghost of a grid for a careful eye. "Do you shoot with this anymore?" she asked. "Not in years," Mott said. "The pods are hard to find and the developer goes bad. I keep it because people ask how a picture used to warm in your hand and smell like a promise." He smiled once, then cut it short. Ria looked at his hands. The nails were buff and free of any crescent of chemical stain. The knuckles had the sketched lines of an arthritic map, but not the dark crust that a person gets when silver salts have made a home in the skin. She remembered the way her own fingertips had yellowed when she had leaned too close to a tray in a lab with a poor fan. Mott's hands told a story of tools, not of chemistry. "You used to project film at the Rialto," she said. "I did until the roof leaked on a Saturday and the owners decided streaming was cheaper than sheet metal," Mott said. He tapped his temple with one finger. "I still hear the click when nothing else is going on. Old habits like to be ghosts." Ria set the camera down. On a side table lay a shoebox of loose contact sheets. She asked if she could take a look. Mott nodded, and she flipped through rows of tiny frames, kitchen tables, a porch with a dog asleep in the shadow of a chair, a mud yard with tire tracks and a pair of boots left like bookends. The frames had a method. Every scene had a pilot mark in the same corner. Someone had been thinking about sequence. Someone had been rehearsing. "How did you come by silver nitrate this month?" she asked. He glanced at the refrigerator, then pretended he had not. "I asked Eddie to pick up odd goods. The mini-mart account's still clear for me because the owner knows I will fix something when it rattles." She walked to the fridge and lifted the magnet that held the receipt. The magnet was shaped like a smiling pump with a hose that curled into a heart. The signature belonged to E. Pike. The item list ran simple: nitrate, stop bath, safety goggles. The total was not small. "You know Eddie well," she said. "Everyone knows Eddie in Prospect Flats," Mott said. "He shows up before you need him, and sometimes that is helpful." Mott had not asked why she needed to know. He had not shown the defensive curiosity of a man with an inventory to hide. She crossed back to the shelf and traced a finger under a row of reels. The cardboard rims smelled faintly of celluloid and dust. The edges were clean. No salt trace, no sticky residue. The room did not carry the metallic ghost of a lab that has been active. It carried only the clean breath of a fan and the weak perfume of a coil of cable. "Tell me about your nights," she said. "Not last night. Every night. It helps me draw the shape of a person." He leaned against the counter and looked toward the window where the wind had set the chimes to a patient talk. "Isit. I listen to the radio. I write reminders. Clean. Sometimes I watch a reel with the sound off and remember that the picture always wanted to run away if you stared at it too hard. The limp is from a surgery that did not take. Nights are worse for it. I do not go far." He said it in the honest rhythm of a man who had learned there is no profit in bragging. Ria glanced down and saw a stick-on note near the phone with a list that read "Oil the fan. Return Mrs. Van Dorn's splicer, and tell Eddie to stop leaving the milk on the porch." The line that mattered sat in the middle. "Tell Eddie." Mott had influence with him, or thought he did. "You have a key to the generator shed," she said. Came out flat. Not a guess or a tease, just a statement she expected the world to respect. Mott shook his head. "No. The town let me help fix a muffler once when the generator complained, but that was with a foreman so close he counted the turns of the wrench." "And the lamps on the fence," she said. He spread his hands. "I know lamps. I know the angle a reflector wants for a human face. I know the angle the desert gives the same face at noon when every mistake shows. I do not place town equipment in the scrub." He let the sentence sit. She watched his face for a lie and saw only the small tension of a man who hates being folded into a question he did not write. She believed him enough to keep walking past him in her mind. A low cupboard near the floor held a stack of manuals and old plastic canisters that once housed instant film. One canister had been repurposed to hold screws. Another held nothing. She lifted it and saw a brand identifier worn to a sheen by fingers. The rim smelled of old developer, but faint, the way a museum carries old air. Not last night faint, not last week faint. Mott watched her and did not flinch. You keep neat, she said. I keep evidence from turning into trash, he said. Order is how you thank a machine that still runs. He grinned again, and it looked almost young. People talk like I am a projectionist. I am a custodian. The image belongs to light. I just keep the path clear. She asked for permission to photograph the scratched Polaroid lens. He agreed. She took a macro series and tagged the files with location and time. Once she had a true scale, she could overlay the scratch against the faint crossbars her fog frames wore. If they agreed, the agreement would not prove Mott guilty. It would only prove that an optical scar was the same scar in two different places. A person could borrow a camera. A person could borrow a flaw. You ever loan this out? She asked. Eddie borrows everything that has moving parts, Mott said. He brings it back with apologies and one good story. I do not lock things from him because he is the sort who will find a way and break a hinge while he learns. Rhea set the camera down. The path between Mott and Eddie had grown a little shorter. What about after midnight last night, she said. Did Eddie stop by? Mott shook his head again, slow. He said Eddie had promised to bring a bag of ice in the afternoon and had not. He had not seen him since yesterday morning at the mini-mart when the coffee machine made a noise like a cat in a barrel, and Mott had been summoned as if he wore a cape. Tell me this, she said. If someone wanted to throw pictures into fog and make them hold a shape, where would the light live? He pointed without hesitation to the spot on the wall where the sun made a rectangle and then moved on. High enough to avoid eyes, low enough to live inside a fence. Whoever does this stood outside a crowd and drew a line that a crowd would not see. You would need power that you can switch from a phone or a pocket remote. You would need air that has agreed to carry the picture. And you would need a person who wants to be believed before anything else. Rhea held his gaze. He had said whoever, not I. He had not shown the thrill that a guilty mind lets slip when it sees its own cleverness reflected back. He looked more like a man who had watched a magician long enough to know which sleeve hid the coin. On her way out, she paused at the porch. A cane leaned in the corner with dents along the shaft where a hand had gripped too hard on bad days. The marks were all right-handed. The limp was left. She heard a train horn far off in the empty land and felt the town bend toward evening again. Back in the cruiser, the sheriff waited with the engine idle and the patience of a man counting beats between calls. Well, he asked. He is tidy in the ways that matter, she said. His hands are too clean for fresh chemistry. His receipts pass through Eddie Pike. The scratch on his lens is a map my fog frames recognize, but a map can be carried by anyone. If someone wanted a patsy, Harlan Mott is the kind you pick. He knows enough to look guilty from a distance and not enough to be guilty up close. The sheriff looked toward the Lucky Ace lot where Eddie had been earlier, then toward Maine where the diner sat with its honest windows. We talked to Eddie again, he said. We do, Rhea said, but not like last time. We ask him to tell us a story and see where the story runs out of breath. She wrote 2 lines in her notebook. Lens scratch equals fog grid. Silver nitrate receipt signed by Eddie. Then she added a third. Find the author. The projector is not a machine. It is a person. Part 4, the motel and the photograph that should not exist. Room 12 had the way of a room that wants to pretend people never use it. The bedspread was squared at the corners. The air smelled faintly of bleach and old air conditioner fins. Rhea asked Gita Noor to stand in the doorway and not touch anything that did not already have a fingerprint. Gita folded her arms and looked like a judge who had agreed to let the case proceed. Rhea started at the vanity. Hotel glass always keeps a memory even after you wipe it. She angled her flashlight and saw a faint arc on the counter where a damp object had rested. It had dried in a shallow curve. She opened the drawer. Tucked behind a hairdryer bag lay a strip of contact sheet, 4 frames by 6, cut from a longer roll with a dull blade. The images were reversed, light where they should have been dark. She held them against the window and let the afternoon make a crude light table. A tub, a hand, a ring around enamel the shape of a kidney bean, a towel draped carelessly, then caught halfway as if interrupted by a second thought. The fourth frame showed the wrist again, slack, with a small charm just visible in the blur. A crescent, maybe, or a letter, silver catching enough light to make a tiny star in the grain. On the margin, in tidy block letters, someone had written "Try the culvert this time." The ink had bled a little where the pen paused. It was a violet tone that did not belong to drugstore pens. Rhea did not say the words out loud. She took photographs of the strip as she had found it, then slid it into a sleeve with a label, date, and her initials. She did not like the feeling that came up her spine. It was the same feeling she had when a negative lined up with a print too well. Rehearsal. She moved into the bathroom. The tub had a faint stain where water had dried around a shape left for too long. The shape matched the contact sheet frame, shallow and kidney-shaped. On the tile near the drain, a smear the size of a thumb had dried to a blunt shine. She scraped a sample with a sterile swab and capped it. She set a scale at the rim and photographed the rust. When she leaned closer, she saw a single dark hair caught under the edge of the stopper flange. She lifted it with tweezers and slid it into a paper packet. Gita spoke from the doorway. "No one has stayed here since yesterday afternoon. I lock doors like I count money. If anyone came, it was through the window." She pointed to the sash. The lock showed a fresh scrape where a tool had touched and missed before finding its seat. Rhea photographed that too. She walked the tile with slow steps and looked at the scuffs. 2 lines near the tub ran parallel the length of a forearm. On the mat, one corner felt damp. It had been flipped to hide the wet. Someone had worked fast and cleaned just enough to let a casual eye pass. Rhea carried the contact sheet to the vanity light and tilted it to catch glare. She snapped 3 frames at bracketing exposures. Back at the cruiser, she would run a quick contrast lift to reveal more in the darkest spaces. She did not need a computer to see the bracelet charm now that she knew to look. It hung from a thin chain. The charm had a notch, as if a small piece had broken off years ago and been worn down smooth by time. Sheriff Villarreal stepped in and listened to her report without interruption. He did not look at the tub until she finished. When he did, he kept his hands on his belt and his face composed. He had the habit of letting the scene speak first, which Rhea respected more each hour they worked together. He called a deputy to canvass nearby doors for anyone who had heard steps or the small sigh of a window being forced. Then he asked Gita for a list of staff who handled room 12. Gita said only she and a high school boy who came by for linens on Saturdays. Not last night. Not this morning. The boy was in school until 3. Rhea asked Gita if she knew any woman who wore a thin bracelet with a small charm. Gita looked at the ceiling for a second, then snapped her fingers once. "Silver Saddle," she said. "Lark Donovan. She works the roadhouse, 2 nights on, 1 off. She has a bracelet like a dance. It flashes when she sets down a tray. She wore it last week when she checked a friend into room 7 for a nap after a long drive." Gita narrowed her eyes. "But because the hand in these frames wears 1, Rhea said. "And because Lark has not answered her phone since this morning if the calls on the registry are any sign." She held up the contact sheet just enough for Gita to see the edge of her wrist, not enough to violate the quiet of the room with too much explanation. They left the Mirage Court and drove to the Silver Saddle. The roadhouse sat alone at the bend where the highway decided whether to commit to desert or return to town. Neon fought sunlight without dignity in the afternoon, and the sign creaked. No vacancy still lit when vacancy was all the place had to sell at this hour. Inside, a man wiped a bar top that did not need wiping. He said Lark was due to start at 5 and had called in sick exactly never. He looked at the clock and frowned. He said she drove an old sedan with a primer gray hood and an air freshener shaped like a pine tree that had lost its color long ago. Rhea thanked him and stepped back out into a wind that smelled like dust rising off a county road. She felt the day tilting again toward its strange weather. Sheriff Villarreal raised the radio and put out a simple request for a welfare check. He kept his voice level. "If she is on the highway, we will find the car first," he said. "They found it at mile marker 7. nosed onto the gravel with its passenger side toward the shallow ditch. The driver's window sat cracked 2 inches. The crack line was clean through the dust on the glass. The dust above and below remained as it had gathered all week. Someone had wiped that 2-inch strip with a fresh hand. The car doors were locked. The keys were not in sight. A drink cup lay in the holder with a lid that showed the wet circle where a straw had once rested. The straw was gone. Rhea circled the car and kept the habit of not touching anything with skin. The trunk seam wore a fresh finger line in the dirt, a single swipe right to left. Whoever made it had not opened the trunk. Whoever made it had wanted to see if someone else had. Near the rear tire, the gravel had a pair of scoops where a heel had dug down hard. A person had stood with their back to the car and pushed off into the ditch. She followed the marks to the edge of the culvert. The culvert accepted a trickle of dark water and the skeletons of sage that grew too low to escape a flood. She felt the same cheap hum she had felt near the generator shed. Some small motor ran close by, polite and constant, the sound of a fan that has forgotten its own purpose. She stopped and listened. Far off, a freight train spoke low. Closer, a grasshopper clicked. In the culvert, a chain hung with a fresh sheen where something had rubbed off the coating. The chain smelled faintly chemical, not oil. Rhea touched her glove to it and saw her latex take on the same yellow as the sage leaves had taken. She lifted her wrist to her nose and let the air explain itself. Silver and solvent. Someone had used the culvert as part of a rehearsal. Someone had tried the scene here before moving on. She stepped back to the car and pointed at the window gap. The sheriff leaned in with a flashlight and looked at the slice of interior newly exposed to air. Dust had been wiped from the top of the door where a hand had reached in with something thin and hooked. The weather stripping wore a new scar. A small square of tape clung at the edge of the glass, cut crisp. A lift had been attempted and then abandoned. No entry marks on the locks. No brake. A quiet hand had reached in, done enough to make a point, and then walked away. Rhea spoke quietly. The photographs from the contact sheet are the same as last night's fog frames. They are tests. The note tells us the next attempt will be at a culvert. The bracelet tells us who is being rehearsed into the scene. If we do not interrupt the pattern will drag us to the next image whether we want it or not. They towed the car to the lot behind the sheriff's office where a tarp could give shade and a fence could give a temporary sense of safety. Rhea sat on the back bumper with her kit open and ran a fast pass over the contact sheet frames on her field laptop. She lifted the contrast and pushed the midtones until the bracelet charm declared itself. The charm was a crescent moon with a notch, a cheap tourist trinket that had suffered hard years and refused to break. She saved the file with a note and a timestamp. She marked the frame where the towel draped as if placed by a hand working from a sketch. That hand had to belong to someone who thought in panels. That hand had to belong to someone who liked to see the world obey a storyboard. She printed a quick reference on the small thermal printer she kept for moments like this. The print looked ugly and gray. It did not matter. It would travel easier than a laptop and would not glare at the wrong time. She carried it to the sheriff and held it up next to the tub photograph from room 12. He stared, then nodded once. "Who writes on the margin in violet ink," he said. "I have been a man with a desk most of my life, and I have seen black and blue and the occasional highlighter yellow when a process map comes to town. Violet belongs to someone who cares that you notice violet." "Clinic supply pens," Rhea said. "Methyl violet. I used one a year ago to sign a chain of custody when the regular pens had gone missing. It bled on my fingertips for an hour. If that is what wrote this, the author works near medicine or wants to look like they do." He keyed the radio and asked dispatch to call the clinic discreetly. He asked whether any supply orders had been logged in the last month for unusual items, even down to pens. He asked for names on the order line. Rhea folded the contact sheet copy into her notebook and felt the paper's rough edge against her fingers. She looked at the horizon where the light had started to thin again into the kind of evening that lets fog walk in without being asked. She thought of Lark Donovan, a woman who likely wore a bracelet because it made light dance when she worked. She pictured a hand reaching to drag a towel and then stopping because the next frame asked for a change. "Try the culvert this time," The sentence read like a director's note to a crew that knew the difference between almost and enough. "We are behind by one scene," she said. "We need to move ahead of the script. We find Lark before someone decides the rehearsal is not enough anymore." The sheriff checked his watch and then the sky. He had the look of a man who understands how quickly a simple line of cause and effect can turn into a net. He said they would set units at the culverts nearest mile 7, and at the rail spur the night crew used when storms took a bridge out years ago. He said he would put a car by the Mirage Court and another by the Desert Spoon. He said he would call the owner of the Lucky Ace and ask about any storage unit keys still in circulation. Rhea stood and closed her kit. The air had a faint bite again, the first hint that chemical weather was moving back in. She thought of the halogen lamps aimed at waist height, the small fans singing in a buried box, and the way the fog had surfaced scenes like photographs waking to their own facts. She breathed slowly, let the taste of metal on her tongue settle, and pictured the bracelet charm again. A small moon with a scar. Find her, she told herself. Catch the projector in the act, but first find her. Part 5, The Culvert at mile 7. The evening leaned toward stillness and then changed its mind. At 2140, Rhea stood at the edge of the lot behind the sheriff's office and watched deputies load gear, as if the routine would make the night choose to behave. The generator logs sat folded in her pocket, a paper weight over a thought that would not stop. Somewhere in the sage, a fan waited for its cue. They set out in 2 vehicles. Sheriff Tomas Villarreal drove the cruiser with Rhea in the passenger seat. Another unit took the road toward the rail spur. The air cooled to that Nevada hour when sound travels clean even if truth does not. The highway cut its black ribbon into the basin, and the basin replied with a shy echo. At mile marker 7, the culvert lay dark as an unprinted frame. At 2338, a breath of wind moved. Rhea tasted the metal note again and felt the small rise of hairs along her forearms. The road light at the marker hummed. The ditch grass turned its blades together like an audience deciding to lean forward at once. Then the fog arrived, not by drift but by decision, as if a hand had pulled a switch and invited it to walk in. It did not flood the whole scene. It rose in a panel 3 car lengths wide and the height of a tall person. The surface had the matte sheen of good paper. Across it swam a culvert mouth, more silver than real, more certain than the concrete in the ditch. The image rippled once and steadied. 2 hands descended into view, bare to the wrist, the skin so flat and pale they could have been carved. The hands held a weight wrapped in a tarp. The tarp edges glistened with chemical damp. The hands lowered and vanished into the mouth. The panel held on an empty frame. It did not cut. It did not need to. Rhea raised her camera. The faint horizontal crossbars were already there without glass to reveal them. The panel carried its own scars. She took 3 exposures and moved sideways to change parallax. When she stepped into the ditch, the fog panel slid 2 feet with her like a projector trying to hold a line. She felt ridiculous for half a second and then angry for the same scrap of time. Someone had learned to anticipate a viewer. Someone had tuned the rig to obey that instinct where a person finds the best angle for a terrible sight. She climbed down to the real culvert. The concrete lip wore a film of wet that did not belong to the trickle that ran inside. Close to the chain anchor, a fresh rub had polished the link to a dark shine. Rhea touched latex to it, and the glove bloomed that same sick yellow. It was a solution with silver in it. It was developer without patience. It was a mistake if breathed too long. Light moved behind her. The sheriff swung the cruiser at an angle to cover the ditch and hold the highway at bay. The headlamps cut across the fog and made the panel glow from within, as if the scene had learned how to backlight itself. In the glow, something small flashed near a rusted grid of rebar inside the culvert. Rhea slid on her hip, reached with the forceps she kept in an outside pocket, and lifted the flash into the air. It was a charm, a small crescent moon with a notch worn smooth. The ring that held it had bent into a narrow oval where it had caught and fought and lost. She held it up for the sheriff. He took in the shape, then looked at the panel where the hands had reappeared. The hands had changed their angle. The wrists strained more. The tarp shape had grown less clear, as if the author had lost confidence. Rhea wrapped the charm in a gauze square and tucked the packet into a vial with a label and the shortest words she could trust. She stood and listened. Behind the road noise and beneath the insect talk a soft motor thrummed. The sound came from the low scrub to the east, the same path where the cable cut had run. She pointed. The sheriff nodded and stepped up onto the road shoulder. A figure slid through the light just out of the beam, the movement a stutter that spoke of a left leg built on more hope than bone. The silhouette paused when the radio on the deputy's belt cracked. Then it turned and set off along the fence line toward the old spur. Rhea scrambled up the ditch and ran. The panel swung with her for 10 yards and then hung back, orphaned by its own rig. It showed now a pickup bed, high and stark. The tarp laid flat against its floor. Two wool wells stared like patient eyes. A handprint appeared in the panel on the right rear side, palm wide, fingers thin. It was the geometry of a person prepping a surface. It was the choreography of a rehearsal. She cut across the shoulder and jumped the berm. The figure ahead made ground with a half-lurch, half-slide, a technique of people who have learned to trust momentum over anatomy. The rail spur sat 300 yards on, a black line that had not borne a full train in years, but still took the weight of maintenance cars and the occasional drunk who needed a line to follow home. A thin fog ribbon ran along the tie line as if the rail itself exhaled. The sheriff's voice came on the radio, stern and low. Units hold position by the marker. Do not flood the spur. Rhea, I am on your right. Keep him on the flat. She did not answer. The ground turned from gravel to hardpan. Sage dragged at her knees. She heard the figure cough once and then again. The second cough turned itself into a laugh. The laugh had an edge that would have read as comic if it had not been in a place like this. The figure looked back one time and the cruiser lights finally found enough of a face to make a guess. Eddie Pike. Eddie cut toward a maintenance shack that had not known paint since before Rhea had moved to town. He vanished behind it and then reappeared on the far side with something under his arm that clanked in a careful way. The careful way of a man who knows he is carrying a trigger and would prefer to keep his fingers. Rhea slowed. She let the world narrow. She looked for the camera angles the author liked and avoided them. The fog made a rectangle over the spur. A new panel. It did not show the culvert anymore. It showed a body falling between two slow cars that did not have an engine. Rhea blinked and it turned into a different angle of the same fall. The panels did not agree. The rig was trying to adapt to a scene that had moved away from its marks. Someone had to be adjusting its aim by hand. Someone had to be watching them. The sheriff's headlights swept wide, then lowered to a crawl. He did not want to blind anyone who needed to keep their feet. Eddie darted for the tie line. Rhea saw the shape under his arm swing and the arm dip to keep it from striking the rail. She called out his name and put all the calm she could find into it. Eddie, do not do that. It will not make you a hero. He did not stop. He shouted over his shoulder, words more breath than sound. He said it had to look like something or no one would care. He said the town sleeps through quiet warnings. He said the pictures make them wake up. Rhea saw the object then. It was a practice dummy, the kind a high school uses for tackling drills, with a bucket of scrap chained to the waist for weight. A strip of fabric tied around the upper arm flashed in the beam. It was a ribbon the color of pale dusk. It could have been anything, but her mind turned it into the idea that someone had wanted the fog to find the weight again if it needed to learn the shot. The panel over the rail showed a figure tipping into the gap. The figure did not look like a person. It looked like the idea of a person, assembled from edges and the logic of gravity. Rhea cut left behind a stack of old ties, moved parallel, and came up on Eddie's blind side. He sensed her and swung the dummy, which made the chain sing. He lost his footing with the swing and dropped to one knee. The chain clanged against the rail and made a bright sound like a bell. The sheriff closed the last 20 feet in a stride that looked slow until it ended with his hands on Eddie's shoulders. He did not tackle. He laid weight and voice on the man and let the ground do the rest. Eddie sagged and then bounced, that small reserve that some people keep for the hope of escape. He turned and reached for the dummy with his left hand, the fingers clutching as if permission were a material he could grab. Rhea put her boot on the chain and said Eddie again, the second time a flat command instead of a name. He froze. He looked up at the panel, trying to hold a fall over empty tracks. The panel faltered, flickered, and flushed to a blank white as if someone behind the scenes had leaned too hard on a fader. The motor in the scrub hummed once more, then steadied. Deputy lights feathered the spur from the far side. The wind moved a small measure, bringing with it the bitter scent of halide and the warmer smell of dust from the highway. The sheriff handcuffed Eddie with a care that suggested he had handcuffed the same man before for smaller crimes in softer nights. "Why?" Tomas said. He asked it without heat. He sounded like a teacher who really wanted a page number more than a confession. Eddie spoke to the ground. His voice had two gears and both stuck. "Nobody notices," he said. "Nobody sees anything until it looks like a story. I only wanted to help it along. Picture is what a town understands." Rhea looked past him at the panel and at the blank that had replaced the fall. She lifted her camera and took a frame of nothing because nothing is a Mark II. Then she looked at the dummy and saw a small glint on the strap around its arm. It was a cheap charm from a gift shop shelf, a crescent with a notch. Not Lark's, a twin, or a decoy. She crouched and cut the ribbon free and let the chain clink in the quiet. She held the charm between finger and thumb. It had the burr of a fresh stamping. It had not seen years of a wrist. It had been meant to read from a distance only. It had been meant to draw a line between one story and another. Rhea stood and looked down the spur toward the black shape of the maintenance shed. A low door stood open. The dark inside had the density of a place holding breath. The motor sound lived in there, or near, or under. She pointed with her chin. The sheriff nodded to the second deputy to hold Eddie and reached for his flashlight. "Wait," Rhea said. "If there is a projector or a relay in there, it will have eyes. If the author is watching, they have already seen us. They will move the scene again and abuse our attention. We need to make the panel lie. We need to give it an image that does not belong to it." She looked up at the small smear of cloud that had gathered near the road light. The panel over the rail had gone to white and now tried to build the pickup bed again, with wells like eyes. She remembered the halogen housings aimed at hip height and the way the fog followed her when she shifted position. Whoever tuned the machine liked a witness to be shepherded. Whoever tuned it assumed that the witness would behave like a certain kind of viewer. "Tomas," she said, "I want to break the surface. If the screen belongs to chemistry, we can interrupt it with a different chemistry. Not here. Not yet, but at the places the audience knows. The diner, the motel. If we make the fog print a nothing where it expects a frame, the author will move to the next plan mark. They will reveal the hand that turns the page." He looked at Eddie, then at the white panel, then at the sky where the night had just begun to earn its name. "You want to make weather," he said. "For once, yes," she said. "Give me the sprinklers at the Desert Spoon and the Mirage Court. Give me access to the valves. Give me 30 minutes with salt and water and the wind the basin already owes us." He studied her face for hesitation and did not find any. He spoke into the radio and named a plan with fewer details than it deserved and the exact number a small town could carry. He told one unit to take Eddie in and book him for the easiest charge that would hold. He told the other to set a light watch on the spur and not to shoot at shadows. Rhea pocketed the fake charm and felt the real one, wrapped and labeled, tucked in her case. She let the two crescents sit as weights at opposite ends of a scale only she could feel. She walked back toward the cruiser and glanced once toward the maintenance shack. The door stood a little wider now, as if the dark inside had leaned out to listen. As they pulled onto the highway, the panel that had tried to show a falling body faded. Over the ditch where the culvert waited, a new rectangle rose. The pickup bed again. The tarp turned down tight at the corners. The wheel wells two dark eyes in a face that did not care. The author wanted them to see it. The author expected them to chase it. Rhea watched the frame until the road curved and took it out of view. Then she said what she intended to do as if she had already done it. "We will make the fog refuse the frame at the places it expects to live. We will hold a mirror where the panel thinks it can feed and make it choke on a picture that belongs to no one but us." The sheriff drove with both hands forward and the wheel under his palms like a promise. He did not smile. He did not frown. He said the words that made everything official. "Let us make the weather tell the truth. Part 6, the pickup with the photographic bed. Morning tried to make a promise again, and Rhea refused to sign it. She slept 2 hours on a bench in the office while the booking on Eddie Pike stalled between minor charge and simple warning. By dawn, the sheriff had to decide whether to hold him on intent with no injury or release him with a court date he would treat like a dare. Tomas chose the move that would let them watch him in daylight. Eddie walked out with a paper in his pocket and his shoulders set in the shrug of a man who thinks he has found the edge of consequence and does not mind the view. The tip came at 9 from a kid who bagged groceries at the mini-mart and had learned that adults listen when you talk like a witness. He said there was a Sunfire red pickup parked behind the Lucky Ace between the dumpster and the old lab door, and he swore the bed smelled like the inside of a drawer full of old film. Rhea and the sheriff took the call, thanked him, and did not tell him not to tell anyone else. They found the truck on the back lot, back tight against the cinder block wall where the photo kiosk had once breathed warm air, and young parents had watched a slot like a mouth deliver envelopes. The paint had that candy gloss that ages badly in desert light. A tarp lay folded inside the bed, its edges turned under like a sheet in a model home. When Rhea leaned in, the air rose to meet her with an odor that any darkroom would recognize even when it tried to deny it. It was the sour work of developer and stop bath when the lids do not seal. It was a ghost of halide and fixer, old as a classroom demonstration, new as a cheap trick. She shook a corner of the tarp free and watched small crystals skitter in the light. They were fine and pale, a frost that had decided it preferred to be found. With a gloved finger, she teased some into a vial and held the glass to the sun. The crystals flashed once and then again when she turned the vial. They did not belong on a pickup that had been used to move boxes and ice chests. They belonged to a person who had asked air to hold a picture. She set a scale card at the lip of the bed and shot the interior in a slow grid, each frame a square cut from a gray quilt. The faint crossbars she had seen in fog did not appear here to the naked eye. That did not matter. She brought out a handheld ultraviolet lamp from her case and passed it over the tarp and the bare metal. Under the wash, fingerprints bloomed the way moss finds stone. They did not sit where a driver would casually drop a hand. They sat in a pattern that followed the geometry of a composition grid, thirds and intersections, a palm print at the frame line, fingertips at the mark where a cue would tell a person to place weight. The sheriff stood at her shoulder and let the light move ahead of his eyes. "Whoever set this bed for work knows how pictures obey invisible lines," he said. "Yes," Rhea said. "And they know the trick of making a town obey the same lines once fear wakes up and wants a director." Tire tracks lay to the right of the truck where someone had pulled in sharp and then backed again to straighten. The rear left tire had met the gravel with more intimacy than the right. It had chopped small crescents into the dirt, and one edge had cut deeper as if it carried less rubber between world and rim. Rhea knelt and set a foam cast frame, poured a quick mix, and let it find the shape. She made a second cast for the front left and a third for the cleaner right rear. When she lifted the first, it held a clear story. Asymmetric tread where outer edge thinner than it should be. A limp speaks through a shoe. A steering hand speaks through a tire. She photographed the plate, then moved to the ground where drip marks from a tailgate hinge told a recent event. Down the side of the bed near the wheel well a smear had dried to a dull stripe. She swabbed it and capped it. When she lifted her wrist to her nose, the scent rose again. That hybrid of chemistry class and apprenticeship, the metal salt and vinegar of a makeshift process. A door on the mini-mart side banged once. Eddie Pike stepped out faster than a man who had just been released should move. He saw the cruiser and arranged his face into a grin that held for 2 seconds and then failed. He shoved his hands into his back pockets and walked toward them as if he had intended to walk toward them all morning. "That your truck, Eddie?" Tomas asked. Eddie looked at the Sunfire red as if seeing it for the first time, the way a guilty person pretends not to recognize a mirror. He shook his head. "Borrowed sometimes. People leave keys where I can find them when they want something done. It is a town. Things get done." Rhea held the ultraviolet light on the bed for one more sweep and then clicked it off so her next sentence would land in regular illumination. "Where is Lark Donovan?" "Eddie." He flinched in the small jerk a person does when a name fits into a slot they had hoped was still empty. He spread his hands and looked at the asphalt. "I heard she called in sick. I heard a lot of things." The fog shows everyone everything and then leaves us to guess. His voice began to run uphill and trip. He reached into his jacket as if for a cigarette and came out with a small black film can. His fingers fumbled. The can jumped once, twice, and then rolled off his palm and hit the bed with a soft note like a button against a drum. Rhea picked it up. The lid had been scored by a thumbnail so many times it wore grooves. On the side, in a careful hand, someone had written Test 2 TUB. The paint pen used to label it had left a half shine. She looked at Eddie and waited. He shook his head too hard. His left boot shifted and the collapsed heel folded as if tired of the lie a foot kept telling it. He said he found the can in a box that had been left where anyone could look. He said he kept it because he wanted to understand how a picture could be used to push people around. He said it meant nothing, then said it meant exactly what she thought it did, then said he had never opened it, and finally, with the graceless honesty that howls when cornered, said he had opened it and had not understood the smell. Rhea cracked the seal a hair and caught the breath of solvent and acetate. She closed it again with a click. The sheriff stepped a half-pace closer. You work for who, Eddie? The mini-mart or the person who makes fog tell stories? Eddie's eyes slid to the back door of the store. His shoulders lifted and fell. Carry things. I do not write scripts. People with degrees write scripts. People who sit behind desks and know how to draw an arrow between one square and the next. They make plans. I just do the part with the weight. Rhea thought of the note on the contact sheet written in violet ink. Try the culvert this time. A pen that bled on fingertips. It came from a place where requisitions live in careful drawers. She put the film can into an evidence bag, sealed it, and wrote the label in a neat hand that would pass an audit. She faced Eddie again. We have your boot print at the generator fence, she said. We have your signature on a silver nitrate receipt. We have a pickup bed set for pictures the way a stage is set for a fall. Tell me where Lark is. He opened his mouth twice and shut it. He glanced at the clock over the deli counter that still showed 6 even though it had been broken since winter. He took one step back with his left foot and the heel folded under again. Then he turned and ran with a strange speed, the lurch that worked last night on the spur, the momentum that forgives a body what it cannot do. The sheriff moved to the corner and cut him off without strain. He did not grab. He stood where the path narrowed, and Eddie bounced against the idea of resistance and found it real. He sagged again the way he had when the chain had sung on the rail. He had the look of a man who understands he is not the main act and hates the discovery. Rhea did not ask the question a third time. When men like Eddie run, the answers are a few yards ahead of them, not in their mouths. She watched his eyes as he settled. They kept jumping to the side of the mini-mart where a corrugated door sat with a cheap padlock that had never once known a key in the dark. She walked that way with the deliberate slowness of a person who has found an answer and does not want to scare it. The sheriff kept Eddie in the corner of his view and said nothing. Rhea reached the lock and looked at the strip of sun-warped rubber that sealed the bottom of the storage unit. A fine dust lined the edge. Her gloved fingertip drew a pale line through it and came away with a yellow film that did not belong to storage. We will come back with a warrant for this box, Tomas said. His voice stayed flat. He looked at Eddie and found in the man's face the small despair that shows when a plan has begun to leak. They finished their work with the pickup. The tire cast set and came up clean. She bagged the crystals from the tarp, the swab from the stripe, the prints under ultraviolet, the can labeled Test 2 TUB. She photographed the plate again in case a person with fast hands chose to swap it while they blinked. She made a note to check with the county about registered owners of Sunfire Red in a 10-mile radius with a plate 1 digit different from this one. People who stage pictures often stage paperwork and always leave the corner of the disguise a little loose. Back at the office, she compared the casts from the pickup to the track taken near the culvert. The asymmetric where sang the same song. Left rear thin where a driver with a left leg that never learned obedience favors the wheel. The numbers in her notebook lined up in columns that made their own stern poetry. In the lampied bed, under ultraviolet, the handprints placed themselves on thirds, as if a teacher had stood there with a ruler and tapped the spots where a student should stand. Eddie sat in a chair under a clock that now insisted it kept time. He folded in on himself the way a person does when they want to cover important organs against blows that are not coming. The sheriff read him the paperwork for release pending charges and explained the rules he would ignore by sunset. Eddie signed. His hand shook at the end of his name and turned a letter into a scratch. He stood, nodded once to no one, and walked out into a day that looked harmless. Rhea watched him go and did not feel triumph. She felt the slow draw of a pattern that had not been interrupted yet. The author remained. The fog would come again because the person who needed it had not been told no by anything stronger than a suggestion. She laid out evidence on a clean table the way a surgeon lays instruments. Silver crystals, a swab that dried to a thin coat of gilt, tire casts with their tired outer edge, a copy of the contact sheet with a violet instruction. A film can that would hold frames if frames waited inside. She placed the charm from the culvert separate from the fake charm cut from the dummy ribbon. One wore years, the other wore a store shelf. Between them lay the scale of intention and accident. "You said last night we would make the fog lie," the sheriff said. His voice carried a challenge without threat. "Tell me how much water and how much salt your plan wants." Rhea closed her notebook and felt the edge of the thermal print between the pages. Rough and useful. "We feed the town sprinklers a solution that will give the air a surface that refuses to bind with silver. It will make blank panes where the author expects a screen. We place mirror boards in those panes and let the fog return an image it did not choose. We will put our own slate in the shot, date, and time. We will ask the machine to copy a scene where the author is caught." He considered it, then nodded once as if that single movement could sign a contract. "Make me a list for public works. I will put my name on the order. While they spin up, we will open the storage unit behind the lucky ace with a warrant in our hand and a lens that refuses to blink." Rhea glanced at the window. The sun had already lost some of its nerve. The day had that hollow just before wind when sound goes farther than it should. She could feel the town leaning toward evening and the rig that waited for evening to give it permission. She slid the film can into evidence and logged it, then peeled a fresh page in her notebook and wrote a single sentence so she could see it in ink. "Eddie is the courier. The author still wants an audience." Then she wrote another, the promise she had made to herself without saying it last night. "Make the weather refuse the script." Part 7, Making Weather. By mid-afternoon, the town's nerves had learned to pretend. People crossed Main Street with a little more speed and looked up at the poles as if a light could admit intent. Rhea spent the heat of the day at Public Works, standing over a plastic vat while a pump chuffed like an old dog. She mixed water and non-reactive salt in a ratio she trusted from a class long ago. A harmless brine that would ride a sprinkler's breath but refused to bind with silver. The foreman watched with a craftsman's curiosity and the caution of a man who could lose his job over the wrong experiment. Sheriff Tomas Villarreal signed his name on a clipboard twice and made the town's liability his own for the hour. "Tell me again," he said. "We are not poisoning anything," Rhea said. "We are making the air polite. My solution will give the fog a surface that declines the picture. Think of it as talc on a palm. The grip will not take. Where we lay this down, the panels should break to blank." He nodded and radioed 2 units to help open sprinkler valves along the Desert Spoon's frontage and the Mirage Court's courtyard. The foreman drove a small utility truck with a tank roped to the bed and a steel wand hung on hooks. Rhea rode on the tailgate and watched the wand describe a pale arc across grass and gravel and the cracked strip where the motel's planters had given up. The brine dried without stain. It left nothing the eye could comfort itself with. That was the point. At the diner, the waitress who had watched fog refuse to show itself the first night stepped outside and squinted at the wand's mist. "Will this help?" she asked. "Or are we playing at help while the town gets played?" "It will make the trick work harder," Rhea said. "Tricks do not like the extra cost." The sprinkler heads coughed once and then began their steady circle. The brine fed the rotor and spat in precise measures across the windows where the first booth had hung in the air. A deputy placed cones at the curb because cones make people believe a plan is being executed. At the Mirage Court, Gita stood with hands on hips and counted the sweep like a coach watching a drill. Her jaw set in a line that dared the night to try her. Rhea carried a mirror board from the back of the utility truck and set it on the motel walkway where the fog had first learned the shape of the tub. The board was the size of a door and backed with foam. Its silver face caught her and threw her back in a pale wash. She leaned it a fraction, then a fraction more until it looked toward a window that would, with luck, soon be the wrong place for an image to live. Evening thinned the heat until the air felt ready to accept anything. They set a second mirror board against the diner's glass, just beyond the arc of the sprinklers. Rhea taped a slate to the bottom right corner, plain block letters with date and time. She stared at the slate as if the simple act of insisting on time could make the night behave. The first sign arrived as a tone rather than an image. The streetlight at the corner hummed, and the hum settled into the steady note she had learned to hate. Then the fog came, not in a wash but in measured panes, imageless, like rectangles cut from damp paper and hung to dry. Over the brine sidewalk at the diner a blank panel stood. Over the motel courtyard a blank panel stood. Beyond the reach of their interference, the fog committed to its talent and began to paint. At the edge of the Desert Spoons, Lotta Booth tried to rise and failed. It turned to a flat gray and then to white, a surrender. The blank looked wrong in the way a missing tooth looks wrong in a smile. People come outside with their phones and recorded an absence that would look like failure later. Rhea did not care how it looked. She stepped into the blank and lifted the mirror board as if she were preparing a flash for a portrait. "Hold," she said to the deputy at her elbow. "Keep passersby behind the cones. If a panel moves, let it move. Let it choose." The fog considered the mirror. It laid a thin coat of brightness on the face, then began to copy the slate because copying is the first instinct of a trick when it does not know what else to do. The mirror threw back the word empty. It threw back the bed of a pickup that was not present. It threw back Rhea's hand as it tilted the board a degree. The panel settled into the lie she wanted. It showed an empty pickup bed and the square date and time. The composition grid rode faint and scarred across the image like a watermark. Her camera shutter made a clean syllable, then another, then a third. Across town, at the Mirage Court, the second mirror caught the same fever. The tub refused to form. The fog read its own confusion and chose the easier path of imitation. Printed the word empty. Printed the slate. It printed a rectangle of nothing, which is still evidence if you give it a frame. The projector re-aimed. Rhea felt the change without seeing it. A pull on the air like the tiny shift in pressure when a door opens in a closed house. She heard it in the way the streetlight's hum changed fret. The blank panels shivered and held. 2 blocks away, a new rectangle brightened, alone over the dark line of the rail spur. It came in fast, no rehearsal, as if a hand had made a sudden decision to punish a witness. The image showed a figure falling between cars. It tried to offer depth where none existed. It showed a sleeve, a shoulder, a blur of hair. It twitched as if searching for the most dramatic angle. The sheriff's voice came over the radio. "Units to the spur by the grain shed. Approach without high beams. Hold perimeter. Rhea, stay on the diner and the motel. Keep feeding the blanks." She wanted to argue. She wanted to be where the blow landed. Instead, she centered the mirror and held it as steady as she could while the fog considered and obeyed. The slate at the corner of the panel copied faithfully. The pickup bed copied faithfully. The word empty held like a dare. She took stills and then a slow pan for motion, the way a person makes a record when they know they will be asked whether the world did what they claim. A second later, a deputy at the motel shouted that the panel had tried to print the tub again and failed. Rhea adjusted the angle a hair and watched the panel relax into submission. Printed the slate. Printed the mirror's flat sky. The trick was learning an unwanted lesson, and whoever held the light would not tolerate that for long. The radio cracked again. "Sheriff to Rhea. The panel at the spur shows a body. On the ground we have a mannequin wrapped and weighted. The subject is not human. Repeat, not human. We have movement by the tool shed." She heard a scuffle through the carrier wave. A scrape, a brief shout that carried both warning and human disappointment. Then Tomas's voice again, closer, as if he had stepped into the microphone. "We have Eddie Pike. Attempted to push the dummy onto the line. He says the picture needed help or no one would care." Rhea swallowed the anger that rose because anger wastes hands. "Keep him," she said. "Do not let him become tonight's justification. If the author fails to wring panic from the spur, They will move to the next scene where the town knows the marks. The diner, the motel. We hold these. The mirror boards threw back her words without language. Empty. Bed. Slate. Time. She watched the fog hesitate and then look for another place in town that would behave. Over the cinder block wall behind the Lucky Ace, a panel tried to rise and then sagged. The brine had soaked that ground too when runoff took the path of least resistance. The panel crawled toward the alley and died. Gita walked out into the Mirage courtyard with a mop handle like a halberd and planted herself between the blank and the air as if she could hold both. She said nothing. She looked like a woman prepared to argue with physics. At the diner, the waitress set a coffee on the sidewalk for Rhea because courage needs small rituals. The mug steamed in the panel's white. Rhea laughed once, low. The mirror caught the steam and made it orderly, a straight rise instead of the messy curl that belonged to honest heat. Even lies want discipline when they are watched. The sheriff arrived 10 minutes later with a deputy walking Eddie in front of him. The cuffs were snug. Eddie's eyes darted between the blanks, the mirrors, the way the panels refused to bloom where they used to. His mouth opened and closed like a man who had lost his line. He said that the author would be angry. He said that the pictures mattered more than any of them. He tried to make it sound like a prayer and failed. Tomas faced him and kept his voice level. The pictures made you brave enough to do something that kills by accident, he said. Tonight they will make you sit down. He put Eddie in the back of the cruiser and shut the door on the man's mutter. He turned to Rhea and took in the mirrors, the brine sidewalks, the blank panels that showed a copy of a copy with the word empty at the corner like a brand. For the first time since the fog began, a corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile. An acceptance that a plan had bit into the hide of the thing they were hunting. Across the street, the blank panel hiccuped and then held. The hum in the wires eased, the way a room relaxes after a confession. The rectangle over the rail spur dropped to white and then to nothing. The night took back its regular darkness in that direction and left only the sound of boots on ballast and a deputy complaining softly about chemical stink. We pushed the author, Rhea said. They will adapt. They will look for a surface they control. If the public places refuse to print, the next canvas is private ground. The clinic has its own vents and its own power. It makes its own weather. Tomas nodded. He had already called dispatch to ask for quiet inquiries about unusual orders from the clinic. The answer had come back with a list that did not belong to a small town's needs. Methyl violet pens. Silver halide cartridges from a vendor that had pivoted into cosmetic phototherapy. A portable fogger the size of a briefcase with a hose meant for disinfectant. He shared the list without flourish. Clinic supply, he said. Signature line on most orders reads Willa Keen. She sits on the victim advocacy board. She would have access to people, stories, timelines. She would have a reason to believe the town saves itself only when it is frightened into good behavior. Rhea let the names settle. Willa Keen. She could hear the voice already, educated and precise, the kind that would write try the culvert this time in a tidy hand and believe it an instruction to fate rather than to a person like Eddie Pike. The blank panels began to thin as the night air decided it had been complicated enough. The sprinkled brine dried to a chalk that did not show. Rhea lowered the mirror board and leaned it against the diner wall. The slate at the corner caught real lamplight now and looked like the cheap prop it was. The waitress collected the cooling coffee and handed Rhea a fresh cup without comment. Gita set her mop inside the office and came out to stand in the doorway of room 12, as if announcing that the door had a new judge. We will flush the lines at dawn, Tomas said. We will leave a residue that will buy us an hour the next time if there is a next time. We will be at the clinic before the author can write herself a new stage. He looked at the cuffs in his hand and at the man in the cruiser. Eddie stared straight ahead now, jaw locked, a courier who had learned he would never be promoted to author. The panel over the rail spur tried one last faint trick and then surrendered. Rhea lifted her camera and took one last frame of nothing because that is how you let a night know you were paying attention. When the last blank faded, the town seemed to remember how to breathe. People drifted back inside with their phones full of absence. Streetlights went back to being simple tools. Rhea stood in the quiet after noise and felt a purpose sharpen. The fog would come again if someone invited it. The person who had written notes in violet ink would not tolerate an audience that learned to ignore the screen. She would escalate. She would need a place where blankness could not follow. Rhea turned the mirror board and saw her own reflection thrown back, thin and tired and stubborn. She pictured a parking lot lit like a stage and a building with rooms full of vents strong enough to carry a plan. A place where pens bled a color that marked a private kind of authority. She closed her eyes once and opened them. "Next stop is the clinic," she said. "We go while the town still remembers that nothing can be proof." Part 8. The author in violet ink. The clinic sat at the far end of Prospect Flats like a good intention, square and pale under a parking lot that always looked newly swept. Rhea and Sheriff Tomas Villarreal parked one slot short of the door and watched the sodium lamps settle into their evening hum. You could forgive a building like this for thinking it was the safest place in town. You could also forgive it for wanting to be a stage. Inside, a receptionist with a cardigan and the unflappable calm of a person who speaks to pain politely asked whether they had an appointment. Tomas showed his badge and said they needed to speak with Dr. Willa Keene, not about a patient, about supplies. The receptionist glanced at the schedule on her screen in a way that confirmed what dispatch had already whispered into Tomas's radio. Dr. Keene had left an hour ago and had not clocked out. Her chart remained open on a terminal in exam 2. Her car was still in the lot. "We will sign whatever you need," Tomas said. "We need her office." Rhea followed him down a corridor painted the color clinics choose when they want to look like they have reduced fear to a product line. Monitors blinked a domestic sort of blue. The exam room doors stood ajar. In one of them, a pen cup held a handful of hospital supply markers, the kind that write on tape and refuse to fade in disinfectant. Rhea picked one up between gloved fingers. The label read methyl violet. She uncapped it and watched a bright tear run from the felt and settle into the glove with a stain that looked like a bruise seen through milk. It bled, slow but certain. It would mark a person for an hour. They reached Keene's office and Tomas tried the handle. It held. He nodded to a deputy who arrived with the custodian and a ring of keys that should have been smaller than it was. The lock turned with a bureaucratic sigh. The light blinked and warmed the room into a tidy idea of itself. If Mott's trailer was the shrine of a man who kept the past ordered, Keene's office was the workshop of someone who believed the future behaved if you gave it lists. On the desk sat 2 monitors and a keyboard exactly aligned with the edge. On the bookshelf, a row of binders wore their spines like bone, each labeled with dates and plain nouns. On the wall above the credenza, a storyboard grid spread from corner to corner, and the paper that covered it was the kind used for school projects and good causes. The grid held clippings, Prospect Flats Gazette headlines, polite crime summaries cut from metropolitan papers when the town earned a paragraph. Next to each clipping sat a photograph printed on low-gloss stock. At first Rhea thought they were hers, lifted from the public portfolio she kept online for contracts and grant proposals. Then she noticed that each had been marked in violet in the corners with composition guides, thirds and diagonals and small arrows, the tidy scaffolding of a person who wanted the world to remain teachable. Her pictures had looked like evidence when she took them. On Keene's wall they looked like lessons. Under the Mirage Court copy, a violet note read, "Try the culvert this time," the same precise print as the contact sheet margin. Under the diner booth copy, a thinner script, "Lower knife glint ½ inch." Under a photograph of the rail spur taken by a reporter years back, a line that said, "If the fall is slow, fear has time to make a call." Rhea felt the slow burn that comes when the thing you take care of is stolen for a worse use. She reached out, stopped, then let her hand hover an inch from the paper. Her own watermark sat ghost pale in the corner. Keene had not troubled to remove it. She had kept the signature like an art dealer who knows provenance adds value. Tomas ran a finger down a clipboard hanging from a peg. Purchase requests. The dates matched the fog's first arrival and the weeks before. Silver halide cartridges from a supplier that had pivoted into cosmetic therapy. A portable fogger meant to decontaminate rooms between patients. Halogen housings out of maintenance stock. Generator access stickers from a municipal request form with a doctor's name on the line that usually held a contractor's. He turned the pages with care and did not say the words he was thinking, because some words you say only to a judge. Ria opened a cabinet and found the quiet authority of labeled drawers. Gloves, masks, gauze. A small metal lockbox sat in the corner. Inside that, under a layer of petty cash and a roll of postage stamps, lay a plastic bag of jewelry. Not delicate heirlooms. Cheap charms and chain fragments, each in a separate sandwich bag with a paper tag. The tags listed first names and dates and places in a hand that refused to hurry. Lark, she read. Bracelet charm replacement, Crescent Stationers, ordered on Tuesday. The receipt lay beneath, clipped to the plastic. A second bag read spare charm for decoy, ribbon on arm. The tag for Harlan Mott's name carried a note that struck like cold water. Potential patsy profile, mechanical competence without chemistry habits. She set the bags down and closed the box and counted to 10 because anything shorter would have been performance and anything longer would have been indulgence. She turned to the desk and woke the monitor. The login screen asked for a password. The deputy beside her cleared his throat and said he could wait for a warrant or he could call the clinic's IT vendor and speak like a person who paid the invoices. Tomas nodded to the latter. While the line connected, Ria pulled a drawer and found a small handheld fogger zipped into a cloth case the size of a lunchbox. Its hose was coiled, its reservoir clean. A set of cartridges sat in the side pocket, each marked with a photosafe halide blend and a warning for eyes and lungs. A mirror square with a handle leaned against the cabinet wall. A slate with date and time tags sat on top of a stack of clinic forms. Keene had built her kit the way a responsible person builds a first aid bag. Everything had its place, and the place was wherever she stood. The monitor unlocked with the vendor's override and a sigh from the receptionist who arrived with a second key as if summoned by guilt. Ria navigated the desktop. A folder named Advisory Board contained minutes from meetings where budget lines fought with feelings. Another named Speaking Engagements held presentations with charts no one would remember. A third, unnamed and nested inside a maze of innocuous directories, opened to show a series of files labeled with short declarative nouns. Weather, audience, trial, prevention. She clicked prevention. Timelines populated a screen. Each began with an incident and ended with a policy change Keene preferred. Calls for a late-night police patrol cut, replaced with a community watch that never filled. A grant request for victim counseling filed, denied, filed again. In the middle of each timeline, a block of text in violet captured by scanner labeled Catalyst. In those blocks she read sentences that did not belong at a clinic desk. Show them what they fear until they reorder their days.
Spectacle Pays Attention.
The immersion will inoculate. Ria opened a folder labeled Cinematics. Thumbnails bloomed. The first was a still of fog over the diner. Another showed the motel tub. A third the rail spur. Several bore titles she did not want to read and did anyway. Prospect Flats Before It Learns. Prospect Flats with its eyes open. Under each, a subfolder of frames numbered like dailies. In one, a still from a parking lot showed Ria herself holding a mirror board at an angle that made the panel give up. Keene had been watching. Tomas stood over her chair and read with the neutral face he kept for words that could ruin people if read badly. He did not reach for the mouse. He said quietly, not to anyone, more to the air, there is a line between warning and entertainment. She put her desk on that line and called it medicine. Ria returned to the main directory and opened audio. Voice memos played quietly through the tinny speakers. Keene's voice was careful and warm as a mother reading a bedtime story to a child who refuses to sleep. We do not respond to simple truths. We respond to images that make a claim on us. If the town will not attend to danger, it must be persuaded. Persuasion requires a canvas and a conductor. She paused as if collecting herself into a thesis. Make them see or make them bleed. There is no third choice. The time between is where the dead live. Ria stopped the playback because you can only listen to a person explain harm as kindness for so long before the explanations begin to sound plausible. She looked at Tomas. He had the stiff jaw of a man who will say in a courtroom what he has prepared to say in his own head. He called dispatch and asked for a judge on the line and a warrant package by fax for search and seizure. He spoke with that even tone of his that lets paperwork move faster than fear. They searched the clinic's interior routes while the forms warmed the machine. In the physiotherapy room at the back, a cart sat ready for an event. The cart held gaffer tape, a small clamp light, and a coiled extension cord that wore a tag marked generator spur. Above the cart, an air conditioning vent had been loosened and reseated. It would have made a neat, invisible fog bank if you fed it the right breath. In the corner, a folded privacy screen leaned against the wall. Rhea checked behind it and found nothing but dust and a single violet pen cap, crushed to an oval. It marked the floor like a bruise. "Where is Lark?" she asked. She meant it to the room and to herself. Every sign said Keen liked rehearsal more than blood, but rehearsals do not always stay obedient. The bracelet charm from the culvert weighed her pocket like a promise she wanted to keep. She walked the corridor toward a door that opened into a side yard where medical waste bins waited with their mouths latched. A low shed squatted beyond, big enough to hold a generator, small enough to avoid notice. The lock had the bright new look of a purchase chosen with confidence and little experience. Tomas came up beside her with the custodian and the keys. The shed opened on the third try and a breath of hot plastic pushed out. Inside sat a compact generator, the sort that can run lights, and a small rack without making neighbors complain. A bank of halogen housings had been screwed to a portable frame, their lenses spotless and their angle set for waist height. A handheld fogger bracket sat empty. A row of silver halide cartridges rested in a plastic tote. The tote's lid wore a handwritten label in violet. "For nights when they listen." The power cord from the generator ran under the shed wall and into a shallow trench that paralleled the clinic's foundation before diving under the parking lot. Someone had cut the asphalt and patched it with a line so neat a casual shoe would never notice. Rhea crouched and traced it with her glove. The line angled toward the easement where the town's generator lived. She thought of signatures on access stickers and the quiet courage of a person who believes good ends secularize bad means. Back in the office, the fax machine exhaled the warrant with a triumphant chirp. Tomas read and signed and handed copies to the deputy and the custodian. He stood in the doorway like a man guarding a door to an operating theater. To the receptionist, he said gently that the clinic would close early, that the sheriff's department appreciated her patience, that the county would not forget to compensate the hour. To Rhea, he said they would find Keen now. They did not have to go far. A side hall exit opened onto a concrete ramp that led to the parking lot. Halfway down the ramp lay a small plastic drop cloth folded into a rectangle, and on it, a violet pen rolled to the edge where the plastic wrinkled. In the air, Rhea smelled the faint, wrong sweetness of solvent that has decided to become a story again. She quickened and then stopped herself and breathed into a count of 4 before moving on. At the end of the ramp, by the last slot before the shrubs, a compact hatchback sat with its rear seats down and a tangle of straps in the back. The hatch was shut, the doors locked, the windows clean. On the rear bumper, a sticker read, "I listen when you do not." The decal was so neat and so meek it felt like an apology written by a machine. Tomas ran the plate and nodded toward the office lot where a second car, a sedan with a hospital parking hang tag, waited in the staff row. Willa Keen had driven to work and then taken a different car home before she left. Or she had staged a different kind of leaving. Rhea's phone buzzed. The deputy at the Mirage Court had rerun the room logs and found an old visitor record for Lark Donovan, signed last week when she had checked in a friend who needed rest. On the bottom of that record, in a different hand, a note read follow-up via board. The initials matched Keen's. The pieces arranged themselves without asking permission. Keen had the motive and the method and the confidence of a person praised for attention to detail in the service of public good. She had the voice that could turn spectacle into a lecture and a lecture into a plan. She had Lark's name in a file that should not have held it. She had a kit that could conjure panels in places brine to obey and in places too private to police with cones. Rhea returned to the office and stood in front of the storyboard wall. She let her eyes go soft until the grids and the clippings and the violet arrows blurred into a single shape. It looked like a map of a town that had been taught to look at itself until it forgot what it used to see. She looked past it to the door and the hall and the physiotherapy room where the cart sat ready and the vent had been loosened. She pictured Lark there, taped, fogger pointed, the bracelet charm tugged off a wrist to make a prop of her instead of a person. fit too well. That made it likely. Tomas said her name quietly. Ria. We do not get to be angry and right at the same time for long. We go slow now. We clear the rooms by the book. And when we find her, we do not let the author write one more line. She nodded, the motion small and sure. She reached into the lockbox and took the bag that held Lark's spare charm. Not because she would need it, but because she did not want it to wait here like a promise made by the wrong person. She slipped it into her pocket next to the one from the culvert. The two crescents sat there like commas. The sentence that held them had not ended yet. They moved, room by room, deputies in a calm line that made monotony into safety. The clinic's halls narrowed to the physiotherapy wing, and the air grew cool in the way rooms feel just before they are asked to hold too much. At the door, a low glow leaked under the frame, a kind of artificial moonlight. Ria glanced at Tomas. He lifted his chin once. The deputy turned the handle. The door opened. What waited in there would turn the night from a lecture into an argument. It would demand a response with hands, not words. Ria felt her jaw set. She pictured a mirror board held just so. She pictured a generator switch and a woman who would not let go of a thesis even when it cut her palms. Find the author, she had written. Rescue the woman the author had tagged for a scene. Keep the town from dying of its new appetite for pictures. She stepped through the door and into the white of fog that had learned how to behave like a screen. Part 9, the whiteout at the clinic. Fog had learned the room as if it had been practicing in secret. It lay from knee to ceiling in an even plane, bright as a sheet pinned to the air. Sodium light from the lot pressed through the blinds and turned the haze into a white that was almost blue. Ria stepped in with her camera tight to her chest and felt her lungs edit each breath. The floor beneath the fog was dry. The moisture rode only in the space where an image would live. Someone had tuned the machine to spare the flooring and consecrate the air. A panel formed at the center of the room and then another behind it, two frames carrying the same idea for a second and then splitting into different angles. The first showed the diner booth. The second showed the tub. A third flared above them both and printed the rail spur as if the night insisted on reminding everyone what fear looked like from three directions at once. They flickered, not because the power failed, but because the author could not decide which sermon to preach first. Sheriff Tomas Villarreal motioned the deputies to the sides. He kept his voice low and steady. Lights down. No rush. He moved like a man in a room full of clear glass. Ria scanned the corners. Physiotherapy machines stood patient and black against the glow. An adjustable table crouched near the far wall. A rolling cart sat to the left with tape and clamps and the neat coil of an extension cord that had already been used once tonight. The violet breadcrumbs were there if you knew how to look. A pen cap under the cartwheel. A felt tip streak on the edge of the mirror square leaning against the wall. A single fingerprint on the lamp reflector that shone like a coin under a streetlight. The fog panels pulsed once and resolved into a fourth image that made the room take a breath. It showed a woman in profile with tape on her mouth. The panel did not bother to hide its subject behind blur. The eyes were open. The bracelet at the wrist was gone. The face was Lark Donovan's. She is here, Ria said, and the sentence had no ornament because it did not need any. She tracked the violet marks. A line of caps lay like bright seeds in the fog. Each stepped on, each crushed to an oval. They curved toward a half-open door at the back that led to the smaller therapy rooms. The fog there was thicker. It had been asked to do an important job and had responded with enthusiasm. Dr. Willa Keene walked into the frame like an answer that already knew its question. She wore clinic scrubs and a calm that had curdled into purpose. In one hand she carried the handheld fogger, its hose already breathing softly into the vent that had been loosened. In the other she held a remote the size of a garage door opener, her thumb on the button as if pressing it kept the room reasonable. She saw them and did not startle. She raised her voice just enough to carry and no more. Pictures save lives, she said. The town does not attend to a simple warning. It will attend to a message that moves. Please do not interfere. Tomas kept his hands visible. He stepped 3 paces to his left to draw her eyes away from the back room. Dr. Keene, he said, there is nothing on that remote that will excuse a death. Lower it and we will listen to every sentence you need to finish. Keen lifted the fogger hose and the panels brightened. The diner booth sharpened. The tub grew a ring that looked like a wound remembering itself. The rail spur printed 2 cars where there had been 1. On the 4th panel, Lark's face stilled into a kind of quiet that no mirror board could counterfeit. Keen's voice warmed as if she were presenting a study to colleagues. The image is the only language we all share. You know this, Ms. Calder. Your photographs taught me that for months before the town had the courtesy to be afraid. Rhea did not answer. She slid along the wall until she stood in front of the mirror board. She kept her hands at her sides. Keen watched her and smiled the way a teacher smiles at a student who has stayed after class with questions. You have invented a beautiful interference, Keen said. I admire it. It will not hold the room if I want the room to understand. Rhea reached down and lifted the mirror by its handle. She angled it a fraction, then a fraction more, until the fog panel read the silver face and copied it. The 4th panel shifted. It grabbed the mirror's lie because copying is reflex to any machine a person builds. Rhea slid a slate into the corner. The panel obediently printed the date and the time in white block. She brought the mirror up another inch. The panel with Lark's face flickered. For a second it showed Keen in profile, hair pulled back, eyes bright, mouth set. The mirror was telling the screen what to show. Keen stepped right to break the angle. Rhea stepped with her, patient and precise, as if she were placing light for a portrait. The panel tried to hold 2 images at once and fell into a confusion that dimmed every other panel in the room. Deputy to the left, Tomas said softly. Rhea, hold that. I am moving. He slid along the other wall, a slow arc. The fogger's hose hummed. The remote in Keen's hand clicked with a small sound like a fingernail against glass. The fog in the back room thickened. Rhea pulled the mirror down an inch and up an inch until the panel behaved again. It grabbed the reflection and printed a future. The future showed Keen with her wrists behind her back. It showed Tomas across her shoulder. It showed the fog losing its nerve. Keen looked at the panel, and for the first time her mouth faltered. She lifted the remote again and pressed hard. The panels flared bright enough to read as glare. Rhea blinked against it and kept her angle. In the back room, a muffled sound came, human and immediate, not theatrical. Lark was alive. Rhea spoke without looking away from the mirror. Dr. Keen, you do not have to hurt her to prove a hypothesis. You have gathered the whole town. They are awake. You can step out of the frame now. Keen shook her head as if brushing away a fly. She kept her voice kind. If I stop the demonstration before the lesson, the town will revert. That is the nature of us. We slide back to comfort. She moved toward the back room and Rhea matched her move. The panel insisted on repeating the mirror's 4th image. Keen in cuffs. Sheriff at her shoulder. Fog falling like a curtain. Tomas crossed the last 2 steps with the speed of a man who has learned to pick the only dangerous moment and commit to it. He went for the remote with his left hand and Keen's wrist with his right. She twisted and found a strength born of outrage. The remote clattered to the floor, bounced, and landed near the table leg. The fogger sputtered and coughed as the hose kinked. The panels blinked once, decisively. One went dark. The others wavered. Keen moved with a surgeon's economy. She let the fogger drop. She reached into her scrub pocket and came up with another device, smaller, a relay with a single button. Her thumb found it by memory. Rhea stepped in and brought the mirror up hard. The panel caught the move and threw the image of Keen's hand on screen. In the reflection, her thumb paused. Reflex hesitated where theory had not. Tomas pinned her elbow against the table and spoke in a tone Rhea had heard him use only once, when a drunk had wandered too close to a fallen power line. Do not press that. The next frame is not yours. Silence took up 1 second, then another. The relay in Keen's hand shook. The room listened to the flaw in her breath. She glanced at the panel and saw herself in a future she did not select. For a fraction she looked younger, a resident whose attending had just told her that a protocol would not save a patient by itself. Then she struck the button. The fogger upstairs and the generator in the shed answered like dogs to a whistle. The panels on the main wall surged to a white held so hard it made noise. The fog in the back room billowed. The machine had been asked to print too much at once. It chose the simplest duty. It laid down full white. A whiteout. The clinic vanished inside its own demonstration. Ria kept one eye on the mirror and one on the room beyond the glare. She could not see Tomas except as a shadow that kept its shape. She could not see Keen's hand except when the relay's light winked. She heard the fogger choke and angry air rush the vents like an old building clearing its throat. She put the mirror down and took a step into the white. The noise in the back was closer now. She followed it by ear and knuckles, sliding along the wall. Her fingers found a door frame. In the whiteout, sound became a map. Tape peels like a guitar pick. A breath through a blocked mouth makes a desperate crow. She reached the table and her knee bumped a wheel. She bent and found an ankle. Human warmth. She traced with a flat palm up a shin, a knee, a thigh, felt tape tack and edge. She found a wrist and touched bone and felt Lark flinch. "I am here," Ria said. The words were for Lark and for herself to make a metronome in the absence of sight. She slid the small trauma shears from her pocket and felt for the spine of the tape. She cut with 3 careful bites and peeled the tape from Lark's mouth. Lark inhaled and made a small harsh laugh that turned into a cough. Ria cut the straps at the wrists and then the ankles. Lark's hands came up like someone clawing to the surface of a lake. Ria caught one and squeezed until she felt squeezed back. Behind her, the white thinned by a shade. Tomas's voice came through it as if the room had dialed the distance down. "On your knees, doctor. Do not reach again." It was not a shout, and it did not need to be. It carried the power of someone who had chosen the sentence years ago and waited for the right night to use it. Keen's voice replied, "Not defeated, not penitent, but tired. Pictures save lives, Sheriff. You will see. The town will thank me when it learns to keep itself awake." Ria found the fogger by her shin and kicked the hose free of the vent. The machine sputtered and died into a wheeze. She reached along the wall and found the switch for the local blower and snapped it off. The white thinned another degree, enough to make edges. A deputy's silhouette filled the doorway with a posture that could hold back a train. Ria guided Lark's legs off the table. When Lark tried to stand, her knees swung like hinges that had not known oil since morning. Ria took both elbows and held until the tremor decided to become posture instead of collapse. The white finally lost its grip. The panels did not go to images again. They went to a dull gray and then gave up. The room returned in pieces. The table first, then the cart, then the face of Dr. Willa Keen, not sainted and not monstrous, only human and furious at the failure of a machine that had promised to translate her hope into order. Tomas cuffed her wrists with the gentleness he gave to people he intended to keep alive. Ria turned Lark toward the door and the waiting air beyond it. She brushed hair from Lark's temple and checked for swelling and found only the welt where tape had been too fond. Lark tried to speak and found her voice small. She got out one thank you and then another in a pitch that did not belong to a cocktail server who could shout orders over a jukebox. Ria shifted her stance and let the smaller woman put weight on her. Together they stepped out onto the ramp, into night that had been scrubbed of its false weather. Behind them, deputies moved through the room speaking a language of lists. Evidence bag, inventory, photograph. The mirror board leaned against the wall with its cheap silver throwing back an honest reflection of a blown panel and a slate that no longer mattered. The extension cord lay on the floor with its tag marked generator spur turned face up like a confession. Keen stood between 2 deputies and watched Ria and Lark cross the threshold. She spoke to Tomas because he was the only one who could make her thesis matter again. "Fear pays attention," she said. "You would not be here without the pictures." Tomas looked at her without heat. "Attention is not consent," he said. "You do not get to hold people hostage to teach them how to be good." He nodded to the deputy with the property envelope. "Bag the relay. Bag the remote. Photograph the storyboard and pull it down. Call for the tow on the generator." He spoke in simple imperatives as if teaching a class that had already done the homework. Outside, Ria sat Lark on the curb and wrapped a blanket from the cruiser around her shoulders. The night decided at last to behave like a Nevada evening after a long day. Wind went to work in the palms by the clinic sign. The sodium lamp hummed in a key that no longer felt like an omen. Lark flexed her hands as if trying to remember what they were for and then laughed again, this time with a little more human in it. She looked down at Ria's pocket where the small weight of the charm made a shape. Ria took out the gauze packet and unwrapped the crescent with the notch worn by years. "Is that mine?" Lark asked. "It is the one the culvert kept when you fought it," Ria said. "It does not belong to me." Lark held it with a delicacy that made Ria like her more for the first time. She rolled the metal in her fingers and nodded toward the clinic door. She said Keen had come into the roadhouse on her nights off and sat at the end of the bar like a nurse waiting to be paged by conscience. Keen had asked what it was like to be ignored when you needed help. She had asked whether Lark ever wished people would look. Lark had said yes, as people do when the question is true and the answer is easy. Then Lark had gone to her car after shift and found a note under the wiper that said the town would see you soon. It had looked like a kind thing at first. Ria listened, then let silence make a place where the next sentence could rest. She said the line that steadies a witness. "You are safe now. The rest is paperwork and sleep." Inside, Keen's voice drifted through the doorway, still careful, still sure. She told Tomas that Spectacle had made every improvement in human safety since lanterns on carriages and colored lights at intersections. She said the town would waste this night unless the story printed clean. He told her that the story would print in a court record, that it would not need fog to stay legible. The deputies emerged with boxes and a bag of cartridges and the small generator set on a dolly. The machine looked less than it had sounded. It looked like a thing that had pretended to be a heart and been caught. Tomas signed a form and then another. He stepped to the curb where Ria and Lark sat and asked Lark if she needed an ambulance. Lark said no, but she needed a glass of water that did not smell like chemical or fear. Ria stood and her knees told her she had been in the same half-crouch for an hour. She shook them out and looked up at the clinic roofline. The vent that had been loosened sat crooked. It would take a maintenance worker 10 minutes to set it right in the morning. The sky above it did not carry pictures. It carried only a few early stars and the flat dark that an honest night gives back. "We still have one more scene to clear," Tomas said. "The rail spur stunt Eddie set is primed for rumor. We will take it apart under lights and cameras and facts. Then we will sleep." Ria nodded. She took Lark's arm and helped her to her feet. As they walked toward the cruiser, she looked once more into the white room and saw the faintest ghost of a panel fighting to be born. Failed. The blank held. She lifted the mirror board with her free hand and turned it face down. "Enough," she said, "to the room, to the night, to the idea that a town needed to be frightened to behave." Then she closed the cruiser door after Lark and looked at Tomas over the roof. He met her eyes, and for the first time since the fog arrived, he let a full breath out. "Next we clear the spur and close the loop," he said. "Then we flush the town and give it back its weather," she said. They drove into a night that had learned, for the moment, to remember nothing but wind. Part 10, the rail spur and the reversal. The spur wore last night's argument like a bruise. Under the yard lights, the rails shone honest, and the ties looked older than any panic. Deputies had thrown a ring of cones in a wide arc, and a utility truck idled nearby, its lamp mass turning ground truth into daylight. Ria stepped out of the cruiser and tasted only dust and creosote. No chemical sweetness, no wrong metal note. The wind had taken the clinic's breath and wrung it dry. The mannequin Eddie had dragged sat where a deputy had parked it, upright and ridiculous with a bucket of scrap still chained to its waist. A strip of ribbon clung to its arm. Ria cut the ribbon free and bagged it. The charm tied to it was a twin of the one from the culvert but lighter, the edges still sharp from a dye. She placed it beside the real charm in a separate tray labeled decoy. She wanted the court to see the difference a hand could feel even when a photograph could not. Photographers always begin with distance. She did the wide frames first, the spur, the shed, the approach lines. Then she walked in until the details stopped arguing with one another and agreed to be a scene. Scuff marks near the rail told the short story of last night's stumble. A heel had dug hard and a knee had made a crescent in the dust. The chain had struck steel and sung. She placed a scale and shot each scar. Her camera's shutter kept the rhythm of a clock that refused to lie. A deputy rolled the shed door up. Inside, a workbench listed to one corner under the weight of junk that a certain kind of mind called useful. Coils of wire weighted like questions. A plastic crate held film cans with neat labels in a careful blockhand. Ria lifted the top two. Test 1 booth. Test 2 tub. Another red spur alt angle. A fourth was labeled pickup bed framing. Every can carried the same paint pen script. Every lid had the same thumb cuts. They looked like a diary a person had kept in nouns. She photographed the crate in place and the labels one by one. Then she opened one under a lamp with a deputy watching. Inside lay a short length of leader and a strip of film. The frames were fogged and streaked, as if someone had tried to teach themselves an old skill using a solvent that did not forgive. It was proof of rehearsal, not a confession, an admission that could live on paper. A second crate held halogen parts and gel frames. Another held a cheap receiver with a printed sticker that said Shed Link. The receiver still hummed faintly. Ria pointed. The deputy killed power at the strip. The hum died. She imagined the quiet line that ran from this shed to the easement to the clinic. A geography of belief. A person had drawn a map where electricity would obey an idea instead of a building plan. Eddie sat on a tie with his hands cuffed in front because Tomas had decided that humiliation helps no one tell the truth. His boots had the same tired lean in the heels. A deputy with a kit took swabs from the cracked leather and from the soles. He ran a quick spot test on a card that would blush if silver salts lived there. The square turned a gray that grew darker each second. The deputy held it up and said the word they needed without pleasure. Positive. Tomas nodded. He kept his attention on Eddie's face. The man looked small in a way that did not invite sympathy, only an accurate measure. He stared at the crate of film cans and then at the mannequin and then at the shed. He spoke in a low run as if the engine in his throat would stall if he tried to idle. I did not hurt her, he said. I was told to make the pictures clearer because the town is lazy and falls asleep between warnings. I pushed the scenes ahead. I did what I know how to do. Lift and carry. Hook and run. I do not write. Who told you? Tomas asked. Eddie looked at the ground. A person who cares more than you and me. A person who said fear saves time. He did not say her name even though the cuffs had already made the name useless. Ria lifted the spot sprayer she had brought in the utility truck. It held the same harmless brine she had used at the diner and the motel. One pocket of air over the ties held a faint shimmer, the last stubborn halide fog that the wind had missed. Under the yard light, it looked like breath that had not learned to stop. She misted the spot with a slow pass. The shimmer broke and fell and did not return. A panel tried to form above the rail, a bright rectangle with no content. It struggled like a cheap trick in a new theater and then collapsed to nothing. The last pocket had been neutralized. She took a photograph of empty air and wrote the word nothing in her notebook because blanks need a label too. Back at the bench, a deputy lifted a lockbox from under the work surface. Inside lay a roll of bills folded with care and a laminated card with generator access numbers hand-written in, the line reserved for contractors filled with a printed name. Dr. Willa Keene. Template. A signature. A trust extended to the wrong idea. Ria photographed each item in place before the deputy bagged them. She did not allow herself the grim satisfaction that wanted to rise. She felt only the slow work of a list being completed. The county tow crew arrived to collect the shed rack and the receiver. They documented the line that ran under the dirt and into a conduit that should have been empty. The foreman from utilities looked tired in a way that meant he had already written in his head the training memo that would start with words about access control and end with a sentence about people. Machines do what people tell them. Policies are only as honest as the person holding the key. Ria took one more walk of the scene. Beyond the shed, a short line of weeds had been crushed by a vehicle turning a tight half circle. The tire marks matched the casts from the Sunfire red pickup. She laid the casts beside the print and took the picture that a prosecutor would like best. Numbers and grooves. Left rear thin. She put the casts back in their boxes and wrote the time and the direction of shadow because small details persuade when the larger ones make a jury nervous. Tomas finished with Eddie. He had not offered him a speech and he had not asked for one. He had written down each answer in the same calm hand he used for budget notes. He had explained the charges in language that did not try to teach Eddie a lesson he would not keep. He had asked if there was anything that would change the weight of the night. Eddie had stared at the mannequin and said no. They loaded the crate of film cans into an evidence van. The labels read like a table of contents to someone else's story. Test 3 culvert. Test 4 culvert alt pickup bed practice. Rail spur second cut. A small one at the bottom read public works sprinklers. Rhea lifted that one and looked at the strip inside. It showed nothing but a ripple and a glare. Their interference had printed a failure. She smiled without warmth and slid it back into the can and wrote its place in the catalog. At the far curve of the spur, a reporter from the Gazette stood behind the cones and tried to learn patience. Tomas walked to the tape and gave him a dry paragraph. No injury. 2 suspects in custody. Equipment seized. He did not say fog. He did not say pictures. He said interference with public safety and attempted hoax. The words sounded dull and heavy in the best way. They would keep the night from becoming a legend by morning. Rhea returned to the mannequin and the bucket and photographed the chain links one by one. On one link, a trace of violet had dried into a faint bruise. She scraped it and capped it. It would test as keen before it tested as Eddie because some marks do not transfer like others. She put the swab in the tray with the fake charm and the ribbon and the film can labeled spur alt angle. The tray looked like a pocket museum of bad choices. A deputy stepped out of the shed with a small paper notebook he had found under a rag near the vise. He handed it to Tomas, who opened to the middle. The first pages were lists of part numbers and lengths of cable. Near the back, a block of tidy print read a plan like a grocery list. Brownout window, generator sink, spray lot, angle lamps to hip, lure audience. He held the book where Rhea could see. She read the last line out loud because it needed to be heard. Make them see or make them bleed. It was the same sentence that had lived on Keen's laptop, the same voice written in a different pen. It made the loop complete. It made the night admissible. They finished the scene the way they had begun it, slow and exact. The mannequin went into a van because rumor breeds in leftovers. The bucket and chain went too. The receiver, the shed rack, the film cans, the lockbox, the laminated card, the small notebook, the ribbon and the fake charm, the swabs and the casts, all boxed, labeled, signed. Rhea logged each item and put her name where her chain begins and ends. She had learned long ago that evidence is a promise to look again. The wind freshened, steady now, the kind of wind that scrubs a basin and keeps going until the desert remembers itself. The small shimmer that had tried for one more panel did not return. The spur settled back into the old work of being a line from somewhere to somewhere else. Tomas stood with his hands on his hips and his hat pushed back a finger's width. He watched the utility crew cut the last dead line and tape it. He watched the deputies close the van doors. He looked older only in the way a man looks after a job that asked him to hold too many roles at once. Rhea walked to the edge of the light and looked down the track where the dark took over. For a second, she pictured the panels the night had tried to force on the town. Then she pictured the mirror boards and the blanks and the way nothing had printed on purpose. She preferred the second set of images. She took one last frame of the rails without people, the ties without weight, the air without an argument. On the ride back, a dry static crackled in the radio and then cleared. Dispatch reported that the clinic tow had gone without complaint and that the receptionist had gone home with a headache and a story too dull to sell. A deputy at the diner had accepted a coffee from the waitress and had poured it out only when she looked away. Another at the Mirage Court had fallen asleep in his car and woken with the imprint of his badge on his cheek. Ordinary returned where it could. We have enough to hold and to prove, Tomas said. Eddie and Keen will not teach the town with their pictures again. The rest is ink and court dates. The rest, Rhea said, is unhooking a town from a habit it did not know it had. We will flush the lines in the morning and tell people that tips work without theater. Tomas drove in that steady way he had, the wheel a quiet agreement under his hands. He did not talk about relief. He did not talk about pride. He talked about utility schedules and a notice to go on the county site and the sign he meant to hang at the generator fence. No generators during inversions, he said. It is plain enough to get laughed at and good enough to be obeyed. Rhea watched the town lights gather and separate as they crested a small rise. The fog would not come tonight. It had lost its conductor and its stage. In her pocket, the two charms pressed together when she leaned, a cheap twin and the crescent with the worn notch. She kept them apart with a finger because difference mattered. At the office, she stacked her evidence logs in a straight pile and set them aside to dry. She wiped her camera down and checked the shutter count in a purely personal habit. She looked out the window toward the desert spoon. Through the glass, she could see a booth with a chipped sugar jar. It was only a booth. It was enough. Tomorrow they would make the town clean again in the way pipes understand. Tonight they had closed the book on the scene that had tried to become a ritual. She wrote one line at the top of a fresh page because it felt like the right place to put a period. The last picture showed nothing, and nothing is what held. When she closed the notebook, the wind carried the smell of creosote and a hint of sage. No metal, no bitterness. Only the old honesty the basin used when it did not have to pretend. Next would be the hangover part, the part where people looked at the day and tried to make it ordinary. She could help with that. Pictures could help with that too, the true kind that sit flat in a file and are enough. They would return to the desert spoon for a final look. They would shake hands they did not want to shake. They would post a notice. They would stand in a booth and let the sugar jar be a sugar jar. Then, if the sky cooperated, they would watch it clear. Part 11, The Hangover of Pictures. Morning came with work boots and hoses. Utility crews opened valves at the easement and let the town's veins run. The first rush out of the lines carried a faint iridescence that made the sun look curious for a second. After that, it was only water. The foreman checked his watch, checked his clipboard, and told his crew to keep flushing until noon. Sheriff Tomas Villarreal taped his notice to the generator fence and smoothed the corners with the palm of his hand. No generators during inversions. For questions, call the county office. The sign looked almost shy against the chain link. It also looked like a rule that would survive laughter. Rhea Calder stood with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm and watched a plume of runoff find the gutter. The air smelled clean in the way the desert sometimes forgets it can. She tried to put a number on the hours since the first fog had carried that diner booth into the street. Numbers did not help. Scenes helped. She thought of the panel over the rail trying and failing to become an image. She preferred that failure to any success the night had promised. Inside the sheriff's office, Lark Donovan sat at a small table with a glass of water and a blanket folded over the back of the chair. She had put the bracelet charm back on a new chain. It hung at her wrist with the modesty of something that had learned its value and did not want to brag. She thanked each person who came through the room with a quiet that turned awkwardness into calm. When Rhea handed her the personal effects envelope, Lark held it like you hold a letter from a better future. She opened it and smiled at the spare charm, the twin that had been tied to the dummy's arm. "I will keep this one at home," Lark said. "A reminder that copies do not count." Rhea nodded. She wrote a simple receipt for the real charm's release and slid it across the table. Lark signed with a hand that had steadied since midnight. A clerk from the county arrived with a stack of forms that multiplied when anyone looked away. Tomas signed his name until the pen grew warm. He read each block of text out loud when a line seemed designed to fall through a crack. He refused to let the night turn into folklore by afternoon. Folklore never helps in court. Harlan Mott came by just after 11 with a box of projectors and a note from the principal at the elementary school. The note said the children would like to see how pictures used to jump and how a reel sounds when it runs. Harlan stood on the sidewalk and waited as if he were asking permission to apologize. Rhea met him at the door. "You were never the author," she said. He looked relieved and then embarrassed by the relief. "That will not stop people from picking the wrong villain when they want an easy story," he said. He held up a reel with 2 fingers. "I told the principal I would teach caution with light instead of tricks with fog. Children prefer patience to most things once you offer it as a challenge." Rhea smiled, a small one that kept its own counsel. "Keep your hands clean," she said. He lifted his palms as he had before. "Counselor's oath," he said. "Custodians too." In the afternoon, Tomas read a short statement on the courthouse steps while the Gazette and 2 television vans that had forgotten to pack empathy aimed lenses at his face. He kept it plain. The county had seized equipment used in an attempted public hoax and a related series of crimes. 2 individuals were in custody pending charges. No one was dead. The sheriff's office discouraged speculation and encouraged people to report concerns without fear of being ignored. He did not say fog. He did not say projection. He did not offer a phrase with teeth for a headline. When a reporter asked whether the town had seen visions, Tomas said no. The town had seen scenes someone decided it should see. The difference mattered. Then he thanked everyone for their patience and stepped off the box as if stepping away from a furnace. Eddie Pike watched from the back of a patrol car that faced the brick wall rather than the crowd. He did not shout. He did not bang a cuff against glass. He looked like a man who had learned that attention does not equal love. A deputy brought him a sandwich and a paper cup of coffee and sat in the next seat because sometimes that is the only mercy a department can afford. The clinic stayed closed for the day. A county contractor replaced a vent and rewired a panel and tacked a sign on the staff door that said Systems Audit. Dr. Willa Keene sat for an interview in a room with no fog and no audience except a tape recorder and her attorney. The recorder caught a voice that still believed spectacle saved lives, but believed it more carefully now. Her attorney did most of the talking. Paper does the rest. Paper has a way of holding a person's mouth shut until truth catches up. In the late light, Rhea walked to the desert spoon. The sign flickered because it was old, not because someone had told it to perform. She pushed the door and let the bell do its tired ring. The waitress, who had learned not to pour coffee unless a person wanted it, looked up and nodded once. Rhea slid into the corner booth. The sugar jar sat where it always had, the chip on the rim shaped like a thumbnail. She turned the jar until the notch faced the window and felt a private satisfaction when the world did nothing dramatic in reply. Sheriff Vireal joined her with the thin smile of a man who has put a day into a pen and closed the cap. He set a notice on the table that the county printer had worked hard to make dull. Anonymous tips welcome. No spectacle required. He turned it so it read toward the room and left it there without ceremony. The waitress poured coffee and left the pot as if generosity were an ordinary thing. Across the room, Harlan Mott sat at the counter and argued with the cook about whether the jukebox could be repaired with parts scavenged from a fan. It was not a real argument. It was the kind of talk that keeps a small town oiled. A boy in a school sweatshirt held a note from the principal and asked Harlan how to thread a projector. Harlan pantomimed the path of film with his finger on the formica, patient and exact. Rhea took a sage leaf from her pocket and laid it on the table. It was not a souvenir from the easement or the spur. She had plucked it on her walk here, a block from the diner where the wind had laid a blade of green against the curb. She pressed the leaf between thumb and forefinger and then held her fingers to the light. No yellow, no stain. She smiled without showing teeth and slid the leaf into her notebook like a bookmark. You look almost satisfied, Tomas said. Almost, she said. The town likes pictures. We all do. We will have to teach it to like the kind that sits still. He nodded. We will be dull on purpose for a while, he said. Dull saves time. They sat quiet for a minute because quiet felt like a rare fruit worth tasting. The bell over the door rang again, and a woman from the county office brought in a stack of flyers about the new hotline for anonymous tips. She set them on the counter and asked the waitress if she could leave a pile near the register. The waitress said sure and did not make a joke because jokes would cheapen what the paper tried to do. Near sundown, a breeze moved along Main Street and the leftover heat gave up gracefully. The sky pulled out its soft blues and then its better ones. Headlights slid through town and did not angle weirdly toward fences. The rail spur waited for the sound of a maintenance truck next week. The clinic windows darkened in a sensible order as the last staffer went home. Rhea walked outside and held the door for a couple she had seen at the Silver Saddle on nights when the band remembered the same 3 chords. She stood on the step and let the air run across her face. Somewhere in the basin, a train gave a single conversational horn. She looked down and saw a smear of dust near the curb where someone had dragged a boot earlier. Told no story, tried to tell none. It looked like life feeling its way forward. She put her camera strap over her shoulder out of habit and did not raise the lens. The booth did not need another picture. The sugar jar did not need a portrait. She would take photographs later of evidence and lines and signs because that is what her job required. Now she preferred nothing. At the edge of town, the Lucky Ace's old lab door had been padlocked with a lock that looked serious. The storage unit sat empty. The sheriff's notice on the generator fence fluttered and held. In the school gym, a custodian tested a borrowed projector on a white wall and let the light run without film for a minute. The beam made a plain rectangle. A child passing the door said wow, and the custodian said wait until you see it with a picture. The child said maybe the rectangle is enough for tonight. Rhea walked home on streets that had learned to keep their shadows where they belonged. She carried the notebook with the sage leaf marking the page where she had written the line about nothing. She stopped once under a street lamp and looked up. The light hummed in a key that did not threaten anything. Above it, the sky kept its cool distance. 1 star, then 2, then more. Not a panel. Not a slice of someone else's plan. The sky. She let herself into her small house and set the camera on the table and the notebook beside it. She washed her hands and watched the water run clear and stay clear. She brewed tea so light it barely admitted color. She stood at the window with the mug and watched Main Street survive itself. Tomorrow they would finish the last reports. Tomas would stand before another meeting and explain that fear does not get to be a department. Harlan would show a class how to feed a reel and keep it from running away. Lark would stand behind the bar at the Silver Saddle and lift a tray and not flinch when a neon letter buzzed. Rhea opened the notebook and wrote one more sentence in small neat print. We will see without a screen. She closed the book and let the room go quiet. Outside, the wind worked the sage and the long grass near the ditch. Carried no chemical. It carried only dust and a hint of rain from somewhere that would not deliver. It felt like the town had put its face back on and decided to keep it. She turned off the kitchen light and left the window to its view. The night did not print anything. It held. Final part, when the fog remembers nothing. Rhea filed her report when the town had finally stopped asking for a story and started accepting a record. The document did not care about suspense. It cared about sequence and names and times and whether a witness used the word saw or the word heard. She wrote in a steady hand. A photograph is a promise to look again. We will keep it. The sentence sat near the end like a quiet oath. The county prosecutor read the evidence like a person sorting screws into jars. Dr. Willa Keene's laptop gave up its timelines, its generator triggers, its purchase orders for cartridges and lamps and pens that bled violet. The shed produced its receiver and cans labeled like chapters. The clinic yielded a fogger and a vent loosened by a careful hand. The rail spur offered a dummy weighted to counterfeit consequence. Eddie Pike's boots turned a test card gray. The bracelet charm from the culvert matched the notch on Lark's wrist when she threaded a fresh chain through it. Even the mirror boards and the blank panels had a place, printed in stills with slates that told their own truth. Together, the pieces made a case that did not ask for belief. It asked only for attention. Dr. Keene met her charges in a courtroom that smelled of wood polish and old air. She wore ordinary clothes and the expression of a person who still believed her thesis could survive procedure. After 2 conferences at the rail, after a judge's reminder that intent does not wash harm clean, she pled to a lesser charge that would live on paper longer than gossip. She lost her license. She kept her words. Some people always do. Eddie Pike stood at the same table a week later and could not decide whether he liked the audience. He faced charges for staging a public danger and for helping a plan that had asked the town to be brave for the wrong reasons. He said very little. He signed where the clerk told him to sign. He looked at the floor when the judge said his name. He learned a new calendar. The rail spur went back to being a path for maintenance trucks and the occasional coyote that liked a straight line. The clinic opened with vents that had been reseated and an air system that would not carry anything but air. The Lucky Ace's old lab door wore a lock that looked like it would keep its promises. At the school, Harlan Mott wrote the path of film across a chalkboard. The children watched a square of light on a wall and said wow at the right places. When the reel ended, the square stayed blank. Harlan told them that blank was part of the show, and the class nodded as if they had always known. Lark Donovan lifted a tray on her first night back at the Silver Saddle and did not look at the neon to check whether it would flicker in a way that felt like a cue. She wore the crescent with the notch and let it catch the light as she moved. After last call, she stepped into a parking lot that gave back only its own shadow and a little heat from the asphalt. She looked up and found a handful of stars. A truck downshifting on the highway spoke like a friend who did not need to be understood to be trusted. Sheriff Tomas Villarreal posted one last notice at the county site and one more in the window of the office. Anonymous tips welcome. No spectacle required. He spoke at a town hall held in the school gym and kept his sentences shorter than the acoustics. He said the town had been taught to look, and that was fine, but it did not have to be hypnotized to behave. He thanked the people who had called without waiting for a show and the people who had stood behind cones while nothing happened on purpose. He did not say fog. He did not say miracle. He said process until the word sounded almost friendly. Ria kept working the way she always had. She shot the last angles on the generator fence and the trench patched under the clinic lot. She processed frames of blank air because blanks are where memory tries to invent. She filed them with labels that would outlive rumor. Then she let her camera hang from its strap and walked without seeing anything she needed to put in a frame. On a late evening, she returned to the Desert Spoon booth because she could. The sugar jar chip had not learned any new tricks. The waitress poured coffee and left the pot. No one looked out the window waiting for a panel to show them what came next. A paper on the counter listed the new hotline number. You could tear off a strip at the bottom and put it in your pocket like a promise between strangers. The bell over the door remembered to ring and forgot to mean anything. Outside, Prospect Flats breathed like a town that had repaired something you cannot point to. Utility trucks moved where they needed to. The streetlights hummed in a minor key and did not apologize. The wind came up out of the basin with the clean, blunt honesty the desert prefers. It smelled of dust and a rumor of rain that would probably not keep its promise. It did not carry developer. It did not carry the bright metal edge that had made a week feel like a stage. Ria stood under a street lamp and let the light mark her shoulder and not her face. She took the sage leaf out of her notebook and let it crumble between her fingers. It left nothing on her skin. The sky above her was not a rectangle. It was a sky. She did not raise her camera. She told herself that she would, tomorrow, for the file, for the part of the job that makes sure the next person can look again with less fear. Tonight, she kept the lens capped. She walked home past the sheriff's notice and the locked lab door and the rail spur that looked like a line on an old map. She unlocked her front door and set the camera on the table and the notebook beside it. The photographs in the case file lay flat and truthful and enough. They did not glow. They did not invite. They waited, patient as paper. In bed, with the window cracked to the sound of night, she thought of the sentence she had written in her report. A photograph is a promise to look again. We will keep it. She believed it not because it felt noble, but because it felt like work she knew how to do. She closed her eyes and did not see panels. She saw a culvert that held only darkness and a diner booth that held only a chipped sugar jar and a desert that remembered how to be honest. By morning, the town would have one more chore list and one less excuse. The fog, if it returned at all, would be the kind that touches sage and rises from irrigation and does not pretend to speak. It would carry no images and demand no audience. It would breathe, then lift, then leave like weather that remembers it is weather. The only pictures left were the ones in the case file. They would be there when someone needed to look again. They were flat. They were truthful. They were enough. End of story. And so, Prospect Flats breathes again. A town that once mistook fear for vigilance now wakes to the quieter truth, that not every warning needs an image, and not every silence hides a crime. If you've stayed with us through the fog, through the panels that lied and the photographs that told the truth, then you've helped keep this small desert town from becoming another rumor in the static. From the Somnolent Conspiracies team, thank you for listening, for watching, and for remembering that seeing is not the same as believing. Stay curious, but stay kind to the dark. Because somewhere, beyond the last photograph, the desert still keeps its old honesty. Until the next broadcast, sleep lightly, listener. Somnolent Conspiracies signs off.